Today, in Audiobooks for me, we are going to listen to Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 9, M. Formery opens the inquiry. The examining magistrate came into the room. He was a plump and pink little man with very bright eyes. His bristly hair stood up straight all over his head, giving it the appearance of a broad, dapple-grey clothes brush. He appeared to be of the opinion that nature had given the world the toothbrush as a model of what a moustache should be, and his own was clipped to that pattern. "The Duke of Charmerace, Monsieur Formery," said the inspector. The little man bowed and said, Charmed to make your acquaintance, Your Grace, though the occasion is somewhat painful. The treasures of Monsieur Gournay-Martin are known to all the world. France will deplore his losses." He paused and added hastily, "But we shall recover them. We shall recover them." The Duke rose, bowed, and protested his pleasure at making the acquaintance of Monsieur Formery. "Is this the scene of the robbery, Inspector?" said Monsieur Formery, and he rubbed his hands together with a very cheerful air. "Yes, sir," said the inspector. "These 2 rooms seem to be the only ones touched. Though, of course, we can't tell till Monsieur Gournay-Martin arrives. Jewels may have been stolen from the bedrooms. I fear that Monsieur Gournay-Martin won't be of much help for some days," said the Duke. "When I left him, he was nearly distracted, and he won't be any better after a night journey to Paris from Charmerace. But probably these are the only 2 rooms touched, for in them Monsieur Gournay-Martin had gathered together the gems of his collection. Over the doors hung some pieces of Flemish tapestry, marvels, the composition admirable, the colouring delightful. It is easy to see that your Grace was very fond of them," said Monsieur Formery. "I should think so," said the Duke. "I looked on them as already belonging to me, for my father-in-law was going to give them to me as a wedding present. A great loss, but we will recover them sooner or later, you can rest assured of it. I hope you have touched nothing in this room. If anything has been moved, it may put me off the scent altogether. Let me have the details, Inspector." The inspector reported the arrival of the Duke at the police station with Arsène Lupin's letter to Monsieur Gournay-Martin, the discovery that the keys had been changed and would not open the door of the house, the opening of it by the locksmith, the discovery of the concierge and his wife gagged and bound. "Probably accomplices," said Monsieur Formery. "Does Lupin always work with accomplices?" said the Duke. "Pardon my ignorance, but I've been out of France for so long, before he attained to this height of notoriety." "Lupin? Why Lupin?" said Monsieur Formery sharply. "Why, there is the letter from Lupin, which my future father-in-law received last night. Its arrival was followed by the theft of his 2 swiftest motor cars. And then these signatures on the wall here," said the Duke, in some surprise at the question. "Lupin, Lupin! Everybody has Lupin on the brain," said Monsieur Formery impatiently. "I'm sick of hearing his name. This letter and these signatures are just as likely to be forgeries as not." "I wonder if Guerchard will take that view," said the Duke. "Guerchard? Surely we're not going to be cluttered up with Guerchard. He has Lupin on the brain worse than anyone else. But Monsieur Gournay-Martin particularly asked me to send for Guerchard if I arrived too late to prevent the burglary. He would never forgive me if I had neglected his request. So I telephoned for him to the Prefecture of Police," said the Duke. "Oh, well, if you've already telephoned for him. But it was unnecessary. Absolutely unnecessary," said Monsieur Formery sharply. "I didn't know," said the Duke politely. "Oh, there was no harm in it. It doesn't matter," said Monsieur Formery in a discontented tone, with a discontented air. He walked slowly round the room. paused by the windows, looked at the ladder, and scanned the garden. "Arsène Lupin," he said scornfully. "Arsène Lupin doesn't leave traces all over the place. There's nothing but traces. Are we going to have that silly Lupin joke all over again?" "I think, sir, that this time joke is the word, for this is a burglary pure and simple," said the inspector. "Yes, it's plain as daylight," said Monsieur Formery. "The burglars came in by this window and they went out by it." He crossed the room to a tall safe which stood before the unused door. The safe was covered with velvet, and velvet curtains hung before its door. He drew the curtains and tried the handle of the door of the safe. It did not turn. The safe was locked. "As far as I can see, they haven't touched this," said Monsieur Formery. "Thank goodness for that," said the Duke. "I believe, or at least my fiancée does, that Monsieur Gournay-Martin keeps the most precious thing in his collection in that safe, the coronet." "What? The famous coronet of the Princesse de Lamballe?" said Monsieur Formery. "Yes," said the Duke. "But according to your report, Inspector, the letter signed Lupin announced that he was going to steal the coronet also." "It did, in so many words," said the Duke. "Well, here is a further proof that we're not dealing with Lupin. That rascal would certainly have put his threat into execution, Monsieur Formery," said the inspector. "Who's in charge of the house?" said Monsieur Formery. "The concierge, his wife, and a housekeeper. A woman named Victoire," said the inspector. "I'll see to the concierge and his wife presently. I've sent one of your men round for their dossier. When I get it, I'll question them. You found them gagged and bound in their bedroom?" "Yes, Monsieur Formery, and always this imitation of Lupin. A yellow gag, blue cords, and the motto, 'I take, therefore I am,' on a scrap of cardboard. His usual bag of tricks. Then once again, they're going to touch us up in the papers. It's any odds on it," said Monsieur Formery gloomily. "Where's the housekeeper? I should like to see her." "The fact is, we don't know where she is," said the inspector. "You don't know where she is?" said Monsieur Formery. "We can't find her anywhere," said the inspector. "That's excellent, excellent. We've found the accomplice," said Monsieur Formery with lively delight, and he rubbed his hands together. "At least, we haven't found her, but we know her." "I don't think that's the case," said the Duke. "At least, my future father-in-law and my fiancée had both of them the greatest confidence in her. Yesterday she telephoned to us at the château de Charmerace. All the jewels were left in her charge, and the wedding presents as they were sent in." "And these jewels and wedding presents? Have they been stolen too?" said Monsieur Formery. "They don't seem to have been touched," said the Duke. "Though, of course, we can't tell till Monsieur Gournay-Martin arrives. As far as I can see, the burglars have only touched these 2 drawing rooms." "That's very annoying," said Monsieur Formery. "I don't find it so," said the Duke, smiling. "I was looking at it from the professional point of view," said Monsieur Formery. He turned to the inspector and added, "You can't have searched thoroughly. This housekeeper must be somewhere about, if she's really trustworthy. Have you looked in every room in the house?" "In every room, under every bed, in every corner and every cupboard," said the inspector. "Bother," said Monsieur Formery. "Are there no scraps of torn clothes, no bloodstains, no traces of murder, nothing of interest?" "Nothing," said the inspector. "But this is very regrettable," said Monsieur Formery. "Where did she sleep? Was her bed unmade?" "Her room is at the top of the house," said the inspector. "The bed had been slept in, but she does not appear to have taken away any of her clothes." "Extraordinary. This is beginning to look a very complicated business," said Monsieur Formery gravely. "Perhaps Gershard will be able to throw a little more light on it," said the Duke. Monsieur Formery frowned and said, "Yes, yes. Gershard is a good assistant in a business like this. A little visionary, a little fanciful, wrong-headed in fact, but after all, he is Gershard. Only since Lupin is his bugbear, he's bound to find some means of muddling us up with that wretched animal. You're going to see Lupin mixed up with all this to a dead certainty, Your Grace." The Duke looked at the signatures on the wall. "It seems to me that he is pretty well mixed up with it already," he said quietly. "Believe me, Your Grace, in a criminal affair, it is, above all things, necessary to distrust appearances. I am growing more and more confident that some ordinary burglars have committed this crime and are trying to put us off the scent by diverting our attention to Lupin." The Duke stooped down carelessly and picked up a book which had fallen from a table. "Excuse me, but please, please do not touch anything," said Monsieur Formery quickly. "Why, this is odd," said the Duke, staring at the floor. "What is odd?" said Monsieur Formery. "Well, this book looks as if it had been knocked off the table by one of the burglars. And look here. Here's a footprint under it. A footprint on the carpet," said the Duke. Monsieur Formery and the inspector came quickly to the spot. There, where the book had fallen, plainly imprinted on the carpet, was a white footprint. Monsieur Formery and the inspector stared at it. "It looks like plaster. How did plaster get here?" said Monsieur Formery, frowning at it. "Well, suppose the robbers came from the garden," said the Duke. "Of course they came from the garden, Your Grace. Where else should they come from?" said Mr. Formery, with a touch of impatience in his tone. "Well, at the end of the garden they're building a house," said the Duke. Of course," said Monsieur Formery, taking him up quickly. "The burglars came here with their boots covered with plaster. They've swept away all the other marks of their feet from the carpet, but whoever did the sweeping was too slack to lift up that book and sweep under it. This footprint, however, is not of great importance, though it is corroborative of all the other evidence we have that they came and went by the garden. There's the ladder, and that table half out of the window. Still, this footprint may turn out useful, after all. You had better take the measurements of it, Inspector. Here's a foot rule for you. I make a point of carrying this foot rule about with me, Your Grace. You would be surprised to learn how often it has come in useful." He took a little ivory foot rule from his waistcoat pocket and gave it to the inspector, who fell on his knees and measured the footprint with the greatest care. "I must take a careful look at that house they're building. I shall find a good many traces there, to a dead certainty," said Monsieur Formery. The inspector entered the measurements of the footprint in his notebook. There came the sound of a knocking at the front door. "I shall find footprints of exactly the same dimensions as this one at the foot of some heap of plaster beside that house," said Monsieur Formery, with an air of profound conviction, pointing through the window to the house building beyond the garden. A policeman opened the door of the drawing-room and saluted. "If you please, sir, the servants have arrived from Charmerace," he said. "Let them wait in the kitchen and the servants' offices," said Monsieur Formery. He stood silent, buried in profound meditation, for a couple of minutes. Then he turned to the Duke and said, "What was that you said about a theft of motor cars at Charmerace?" When he received the letter from Arsène Lupin, Monsieur Gournay-Martin decided to start for Paris at once, said the Duke. But when we sent for the cars, we found that they had just been stolen. Monsieur Gournay-Martin's chauffeur and another servant were in the garage gagged and bound. Only an old car, 100-horsepower Mercrac, was left. I drove it to Paris, leaving Monsieur Gournay-Martin and his family to come on by train. Very important. Very important indeed, said Monsieur Formery. He thought for a moment and then added, "Were the motor cars the only things stolen? Were there no other thefts?" "Well, as a matter of fact, there was another theft, or rather, an attempt at theft, said the Duke with some hesitation. The rogues who stole the motor cars presented themselves at the château under the name of Charolais, a father and 3 sons, on the pretext of buying the 100-horsepower Mercrac. Monsieur Gournay-Martin had advertised it for sale in the Rennes Advertiser. They were waiting in the big hall of the château, which the family uses as the chief living room, for the return of Monsieur Gournay-Martin. He came, and as they left the hall, one of them attempted to steal a pendant set with pearls, which I had given to Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin half an hour before. I caught him in the act and saved the pendant. Good, good, wait. We have one of the gang. Wait till I question him, said Monsieur Formerie, rubbing his hands, and his eyes sparkled with joy. Well, no, I'm afraid we haven't, said the Duke in an apologetic tone. What? We haven't? Has he escaped from the police? Oh, those country police, cried Monsieur Formerie. No, I didn't charge him with the theft, said the Duke. You didn't charge him with the theft? Cried Monsieur Formerie, astounded. No, he was very young, and he begged so hard. I had the pendant. I let him go, said the Duke. Oh, your Grace, your duty to society, cried Monsieur Formerie. Yes, it does seem to have been rather weak, said the Duke, but there you are. It's no good crying over spilt milk. Monsieur Formerie folded his arms and walked frowning backwards and forwards across the room. He stopped, raised his hand, with a gesture commanding attention, and said, I have no hesitation in saying that there is a connection, an intimate connection, between the thefts at Charmerace and this burglary. The Duke and the inspector gazed at him with respectful eyes. At least the eyes of the inspector were respectful. The Duke's eyes twinkled. I am gathering up the threads, said Monsieur Formerie. Inspector, bring up the concierge and his wife. I will question them on the scene of the crime. Their dossier should be here. If it is, bring it up with them. If not, no matter. Bring them up without it. The inspector left the drawing-room. Monsieur Formerie plunged at once into frowning meditation. I find all this extremely interesting, said the Duke. Charmed, said Monsieur Formerie, waving his hand with an absent-minded air. The inspector entered the drawing-room, followed by the concierge and his wife. He handed a paper to Monsieur Formerie. The concierge, a bearded man of about 60, and his wife, a somewhat bearded woman of about 55, stared at Monsieur Formerie with fascinated, terrified eyes. He sat down in a chair, crossed his legs, read the paper through, and then scrutinized them keenly. Well, have you recovered from your adventure? He said. Oh, yes, sir, said the concierge. They hustled us a bit, but they did not really hurt us. Nothing to speak of, that is, said his wife, but all the same, it's a disgraceful thing that an honest woman can't sleep in peace in her bed of a night without being disturbed by rascals like that. And if the police did their duty, things like this wouldn't happen, and I don't care who hears me say it. You say that you were taken by surprise in your sleep, said Monsieur Formerie. You say you saw nothing and heard nothing? There was no time to see anything or hear anything. They trussed us up like greased lightning, said the concierge. But the gag was the worst, said the wife, to lie there and not be able to tell the rascals what I thought about them. Didn't you hear the noise of footsteps in the garden? Said Monsieur Formerie. One can't hear anything that happens in the garden from our bedroom, said the concierge. Even the night when Mademoiselle Germain's Great Dane barked from 12 o'clock till 7 in the morning. All the household was kept awake except us. But bless you, sir, we slept like tops, said his wife proudly. If they sleep like that, it seems rather a waste of time to have gagged them, whispered the Duke to the inspector. The inspector grinned and whispered scornfully, "Oh, them common folks, they do sleep like that, your grace." "Didn't you hear any noise at the front door?" said Monsieur Formery. "No, we heard no noise at the door," said the concierge. "Then you heard no noise at all the whole night?" said Monsieur Formery. "Oh, yes, sir, we heard noise enough after we'd been gagged," said the concierge. "Now, this is important," said Monsieur Formery. "What kind of a noise was it?" "Well, it was a bumping kind of noise," said the concierge, "and there was a noise of footsteps walking about the room." "What room? Where did these noises come from?" said Monsieur Formery. "From the room over our heads, the big drawing room," said the concierge. "Didn't you hear any noise of a struggle, as if somebody was being dragged about? No screaming or crying?" said Monsieur Formery. The concierge and his wife looked at one another with inquiring eyes. "No, I didn't," said the concierge. "Neither did I," said his wife. Monsieur Formery paused. Then he said, "How long have you been in the service of Monsieur Gournay-Martin?" "A little more than a year," said the concierge. Monsieur Formery looked at the paper in his hand, frowned, and said severely, "I see you've been convicted twice, my man." "Yes, sir, but—" "My husband's an honest man, sir. Perfectly honest," broke in his wife. "You've only to ask Monsieur Gournay-Martin. He'll—" "Be so good as to keep quiet, my good woman," said Monsieur Formery, and turning to her husband, he went on. "At your first conviction, you were sentenced to a day's imprisonment with costs. At your second conviction, you got 3 days' imprisonment." "I'm not going to deny it, sir," said the concierge, "but it was an honorable imprisonment." "Honorable?" said Monsieur Formery. "The first time I was a gentleman's servant, and I got a day's imprisonment for crying, 'Hurrah for the general strike,' on the 1st of May. "You were a valet? In whose service?" said Monsieur Formery. "In the service of Monsieur Genlis, the socialist leader." "And your second conviction?" said Monsieur Formery. "It was for having cried in the porch of Sainte Clotilde, 'Down with the cows,' meaning the police, sir," said the concierge. "And were you in the service of Monsieur Genlis then?" said Monsieur Formery. "No, sir. I was in the service of Monsieur Bassy-Rabutin, the royalist deputy." "You don't seem to have very well-defined political convictions," said Monsieur Formery. "Oh, yes, sir, I have," the concierge protested. "I'm always devoted to my masters, and I have the same opinions that they have, always." "Very good. You can go," said Monsieur Formery. The concierge and his wife left the room, looking as if they did not quite know whether to feel relieved or not. "Those two fools are telling the exact truth, unless I'm very much mistaken," said Monsieur Formery. "They look honest enough people," said the Duke. "Well, now to examine the rest of the house," said Monsieur Formery. "I'll come with you if I may," said the Duke. By all means," said Monsieur Formery. "I find it all so interesting," said the Duke. Chapter 10. Gertrude assists. Leaving a policeman on guard at the door of the drawing-room, Monsieur Formery, the Duke, and the inspector set out on their tour of inspection. It was a long business, for Monsieur Formery examined every room with the most scrupulous care, with more care, indeed, than he had displayed in his examination of the drawing-rooms. In particular, he lingered long in the bedroom of Victoire, discussing the possibilities of her having been murdered and carried away by the burglars along with their booty. He seemed, if anything, disappointed at finding no bloodstains, but to find real consolation in the thought that she might have been strangled. He found the inspector in entire agreement with every theory he enunciated, and he grew more and more disposed to regard him as a zealous and trustworthy officer. Also, he was not at all displeased at enjoying this opportunity of impressing the Duke with his powers of analysis and synthesis. He was unaware that, as a rule, the Duke's eyes did not usually twinkle as they twinkled during this solemn and deliberate progress through the house of Monsieur Gournay-Martin. Monsieur Formerie had so exactly the air of a sleuth-hound, and he was even noisier. Having made this thorough examination of the house, Monsieur Formerie went out into the garden and set about examining that. There were footprints on the turf about the foot of the ladder, for the grass was close-clipped, and the rain had penetrated and softened the soil, but there were hardly as many footprints as might have been expected, seeing that the burglars must have made many journeys in the course of robbing the drawing rooms of so many objects of art, some of them of considerable weight. The footprints led to a path of hard gravel, and Monsieur Formerie led the way down it, out of the door in the wall, at the bottom of the garden, and into the space round the house which was being built. As Monsieur Formerie had divined, there was a heap, or to be exact, there were several heaps of plaster about the bottom of the scaffolding. Unfortunately, there were also hundreds of footprints. Monsieur Formerie looked at them with longing eyes, but he did not suggest that the inspector should hunt about for a set of footprints of the size of the one he had so carefully measured on the drawing-room carpet. While they were examining the ground round the half-built house, a man came briskly down the stairs from the second floor of the house of Monsieur Gournay-Martin. He was an ordinary-looking man, almost insignificant, of between 40 and 50, and of rather more than middle height. He had an ordinary, rather shapeless mouth, an ordinary nose, an ordinary chin, an ordinary forehead, rather low, and ordinary ears. He was wearing an ordinary top hat, by no means new. His clothes were the ordinary clothes of a fairly well-to-do citizen, and his boots had been chosen less to set off any slenderness his feet might possess than for their comfortable roominess. Only his eyes relieved his face from insignificance. They were extraordinarily alert eyes, producing in those on whom they rested the somewhat uncomfortable impression that the depths of their souls were being penetrated. He was the famous Chief Inspector Guerchard, head of the detective department of the Prefecture of Police, and sworn foe of Arsène Lupin. The policeman at the door of the drawing-room saluted him briskly. He was a fine, upstanding, red-faced young fellow, adorned by a rich black moustache of extraordinary fierceness. "Shall I go and inform Monsieur Formerie that you have come, Monsieur Guerchard?" he said. No, there's no need to take the trouble," said Guerchard in a gentle, rather husky voice. "Don't bother anyone about me. I'm of no importance." "Oh, come, Monsieur Guerchard," protested the policeman. "Of no importance," said Monsieur Guerchard decisively. "For the present, Monsieur Formerie is everything. I'm only an assistant." He stepped into the drawing-room and stood looking about it, curiously still. It was almost as if the whole of his being was concentrated in the act of seeing, as if all the other functions of his mind and body were in suspension. "Monsieur Formerie and the inspector have just been up to examine the housekeeper's room. It's right at the top of the house, on the second floor. You take the servants' staircase. Then it's right at the end of the passage on the left. Would you like me to take you up to it, sir?" said the policeman eagerly. His heart was in his work. "Thank you. I know where it is. I've just come from it," said Guerchard gently. A grin of admiration widened the already wide mouth of the policeman and showed a row of very white, able-looking teeth. "Ah, Monsieur Guerchard," he said, "you're cleverer than all the examining magistrates in Paris put together." "You ought not to say that, my good fellow. I can't prevent you thinking it, of course. But you ought not to say it," said Guerchard with husky gentleness, and the faintest smile played round the corners of his mouth. He walked slowly to the window, and the policeman walked with him. "Have you noticed this, sir?" said the policeman, taking hold of the top of the ladder with a powerful hand. "It's probable that the burglars came in and went away by this ladder." "Thank you," said Guerchard. "They have even left this card table on the window-sill," said the policeman, and he patted the card table with his other powerful hand. Thank you," said Guerchard. "They don't think it's Lupin's work at all," said the policeman. "They think that Lupin's letter announcing the burglary and these signatures on the walls are only a ruse." "Is that so?" said Guerchard. "Is there any way I can help you, sir?" said policeman. "Yes," said Guerchard. "Take up your post outside that door, and admit no one but Monsieur Formery, the inspector, Bonavent or Ducy, without consulting me." And he pointed to the drawing-room door. "Shan't I admit the Duke of Charmerace? He's taking a great interest in this affair," said the policeman. "The Duke of Charmerace? Oh, yes. Admit the Duke of Charmerace," said Guerchard. The policeman went to his post of responsibility, a proud man. Hardly had the door closed behind him when Guerchard was all activity and eyes. He examined the ladder, the gaps on the wall from which the pictures had been taken, the signatures of Arsène Lupin. The very next thing he did was to pick up the book which the Duke had set on the top of the footprint again, to preserve it, and he measured, pacing it, the distance between the footprint and the window. The result of this measuring did not appear to cause him any satisfaction, for he frowned, measured the distance again, and then stared out of the window with a perplexed air, thinking hard. It was curious that, when he concentrated himself on a process of reasoning, his eyes seemed to lose something of their sharp brightness and grew a little dim. At last, he seemed to come to some conclusion. He turned away from the window, drew a small magnifying glass from his pocket, dropped on his hands and knees, and began to examine the surface of the carpet with the most minute care. He examined a space of it, nearly 6 feet square, stopped, and gazed round the room. His eyes rested on the fireplace, which he could see under the bottom of the big tapestried fire screen, which was raised on legs about a foot high, fitted with big casters. His eyes filled with interest. Without rising, he crawled quickly across the room, peeped round the edge of the screen, and rose, smiling. He went on to the further drawing-room and made the same careful examination of it, again examining a part of the surface of the carpet with his magnifying glass. He came back to the window to which the ladder had been raised and examined very carefully the broken shutter. He whistled softly to himself, lighted a cigarette, and leant against the side of the window. He looked out of it with dull eyes which saw nothing, the while his mind worked upon the facts he had discovered. He had stood there plunged in reflection for perhaps 10 minutes, when there came a sound of voices and footsteps on the stairs. He awoke from his absorption, seemed to prick his ears, then slipped a leg over the window ledge and disappeared from sight down the ladder. The door opened, and in came Monsieur Formery, the Duke, and the inspector. Monsieur Formery looked round the room with eyes which seemed to expect to meet a familiar sight, then walked to the other drawing-room and looked round that. He turned to the policeman, who had stepped inside the drawing-room, and said sharply, "Monsieur Guerchard is not here." "I left him here," said the policeman. "He must have disappeared. He's a wonder." "Of course," said Monsieur Formery. "He has gone down the ladder to examine that house they're building. He's just following in our tracks and doing all over again the work we've already done. He might have saved himself the trouble. We could have told him all he wants to know. But there, he very likely would not be satisfied till he had seen everything for himself." "He may see something which we have missed," said the Duke. Monsieur Formery frowned and said sharply, "That's hardly likely. I don't think that your Grace realizes to what a perfection constant practice brings one's power of observation. The Inspector and I will cheerfully eat anything we've missed, won't we, Inspector?" And he laughed heartily at his joke. "It might always prove a large mouthful," said the Duke, with an ironical smile. Monsieur Formery assumed his air of profound reflection and walked a few steps up and down the room, frowning. "The more I think about it," he said, "the clearer it grows that we have disposed of the Lupin theory. This is the work of far less expert rogues than Lupin. What do you think, Inspector?" "Yes, I think you have disposed of that theory, sir," said the Inspector, with ready acquiescence. "All the same, I'd wager anything that we haven't disposed of it to the satisfaction of Guerchard," said Monsieur Formery. "Then he must be very hard to satisfy," said the Duke. "Oh, in any other matter he's open to reason," said Monsieur Formery. "But Lupin is his fixed idea. It's an obsession, almost a mania." "But yet he never catches him," said the Duke. "No, and he never will. His very obsession by Lupin hampers him. It cramps his mind and hinders its working," said Monsieur Formery. He resumed his meditative pacing, stopped again, and said, "But considering everything, especially the absence of any traces of violence, combined with her entire disappearance, I have come to another conclusion. Victoire is the key to the mystery. She is the accomplice. She never slept in her bed. She unmade it to put us off the scent. That, at any rate, is something gained, to have found the accomplice. We shall have this good news at least to tell M. Gournay-Martin on his arrival." "Do you really think that she's the accomplice?" said the Duke. "I'm dead sure of it," said Monsieur Formery. "We will go up to her room and make another thorough examination of it." Guerchard's head popped up above the window-sill. "My dear Monsieur Formery," he said, "I beg that you will not take the trouble." Monsieur Formery's mouth opened. "What? You, Guerchard?" he stammered. "Myself," said Guerchard, and he came to the top of the ladder and slipped lightly over the window-sill into the room. He shook hands with Monsieur Formery and nodded to the inspector. Then he looked at the Duke with an air of inquiry. "Let me introduce you," said Monsieur Formery. "Chief Inspector Guerchard, head of the detective department, the Duke of Charmerace." The Duke shook hands with Guerchard, saying, "I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, Monsieur Guerchard. I've been expecting your coming with the greatest interest. Indeed, it was I who begged the officials at the Prefecture of Police to put this case in your hands. I insisted on it." "What were you doing on that ladder?" said Monsieur Formery, giving Guerchard no time to reply to the Duke. "I was listening," said Guerchard simply. "Listening. I like to hear people talk when I'm engaged on a case. It's a distraction, and it helps. I really must congratulate you, my dear Monsieur Formery, on the admirable manner in which you have conducted this inquiry." Monsieur Formery bowed and regarded him with a touch of suspicion. "There are one or two minor points on which we do not agree, but on the whole your method has been admirable," said Guerchard. "Well, about Victoire," said Monsieur Formery, "you're quite sure that an examination, a more thorough examination of her room, is unnecessary?" "Yes, I think so," said Guerchard. "I have just looked at it myself." The door opened, and in came Bonavent, one of the detectives who had come earlier from the prefecture. In his hand, he carried a scrap of cloth. He saluted Guerchard and said to Monsieur Formery, "I have just found this scrap of cloth on the edge of the well at the bottom of the garden. The concierge's wife tells me that it has been torn from Victoire's dress." "I feared it," said Monsieur Formery, taking the scrap of cloth from him. "I feared foul play. We must go to the well at once, send someone down it, or have it dragged." He was moving hastily to the door, when Gershard said, in his husky, gentle voice, "I don't think there is any need to look for Victoire in the well." "But this scrap of cloth," said Monsieur Formerie, holding it out to him. "Yes, yes, that scrap of cloth," said Gershard. And turning to the Duke, he added, "Do you know if there's a dog or cat in the house, Your Grace? I suppose that, as the fiancé of Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin, you are familiar with the house?" "What on earth?" said Monsieur Formerie. "Excuse me," interrupted Gershard, "but this is important, very important." "Yes, there is a cat," said the Duke. "I've seen a cat at the door of the concierge's rooms." "It must have been that cat which took this scrap of cloth to the edge of the well," said Gershard gravely. "This is ridiculous, preposterous," cried Monsieur Formerie, beginning to flush. "Here we're dealing with a most serious crime, a murder, the murder of Victoire, and you talk about cats." "Victoire has not been murdered," said Gershard, and his husky voice was gentler than ever, only just audible. "But we don't know that. We know nothing of the kind," said Monsieur Formerie. "I do," said Gershard. "You?" said Monsieur Formerie. "Yes," said Gershard. "Then how do you explain her disappearance?" "If she had disappeared, I shouldn't explain it," said Gershard. "But since she has disappeared," cried Monsieur Formerie in a tone of exasperation. "She hasn't," said Gershard. "You know nothing about it," cried Monsieur Formerie, losing his temper. "Yes, I do," said Gershard with the same gentleness. "Come, do you mean to say that you know where she is?" cried Monsieur Formerie. "Certainly," said Gershard. "Do you mean to tell us straight out that you've seen her?" cried Monsieur Formerie. "Oh, yes, I've seen her," said Gershard. "You've seen her? When?" cried Monsieur Formerie. Gershard paused to consider. Then he said gently, "It must have been between 4 and 5 minutes ago." "But hang it all, you haven't been out of this room," cried Monsieur Formerie. "No, I haven't," said Gershard. "And you've seen her?" cried Monsieur Formerie. "Yes," said Gershard, raising his voice a little. "Well, why the devil don't you tell us where she is? Tell us," cried Monsieur Formerie, purple with exasperation. "But you won't let me get a word out of my mouth," protested Gershard with aggravating gentleness. "Well, speak," cried Monsieur Formerie, and he sank gasping onto a chair. "Ah, well, she's here," said Gershard. "Here, how did she get here?" said Monsieur Formerie. "On a mattress," said Gershard. Monsieur Formerie sat upright, almost beside himself, glaring furiously at Gershard. "What do you stand there, pulling all our legs for?" he almost howled. "Look here," said Gershard. He walked across the room to the fireplace, pushed the chairs which stood bound together on the hearth-rug to one side of the fireplace, and ran the heavy fire screen on its casters to the other side of it, revealing to their gaze the wide, old-fashioned fireplace itself. The iron brazier which held the coals had been moved into the corner, and a mattress lay on the floor of the fireplace. On the mattress lay the figure of a big, middle-aged woman, half-dressed. There was a yellow gag in her mouth, and her hands and feet were bound together with blue cords. "She is sleeping soundly," said Gershard. He stooped and picked up a handkerchief and smelt it. "There's the handkerchief they chloroformed her with. It still smells of chloroform." They stared at him and the sleeping woman. "Lend a hand, Inspector," he said. "And you too, Bonavent. She looks a good weight." The three of them raised the mattress and carried it and the sleeping woman to a broad couch and laid them on it. They staggered under their burden, for truly Victoire was a good weight. Monsieur Formerie rose with recovered breath, but with his face an even richer purple. His eyes were rolling in his head, as if they were not under proper control. He turned on the inspector and cried savagely, You never examined the fireplace, Inspector." "No, sir," said the downcast inspector. "It was unpardonable, absolutely unpardonable," cried Monsieur Formery. "How is one to work with subordinates like this?" "It was an oversight," said Guerchard. Monsieur Formery turned to him and said, "You must admit that it was materially impossible for me to see her." "It was possible if you went down on all fours," said Guerchard. "On all fours?" said Monsieur Formery. "Yes, on all fours you could see her heels sticking out beyond the mattress," said Guerchard simply. Monsieur Formery shrugged his shoulders. "That screen looked as if it had stood there since the beginning of the summer," he said. "The first thing, when you're dealing with Lupin, is to distrust appearances," said Guerchard. "Lupin!" cried Monsieur Formery hotly. Then he bit his lip and was silent. He walked to the side of the couch and looked down on the sleeping Victoire, frowning. "This upsets everything," he said. "With these new conditions, I've got to begin all over again to find a new explanation of the affair. For the moment, I'm thrown completely off the track. And you, Guerchard?" "Oh, well," said Guerchard, "I have an idea or two about the matter still." "Do you really mean to say that it hasn't thrown you off the track too?" said Monsieur Formery, with a touch of incredulity in his tone. "Well, no, not exactly," said Guerchard. "I wasn't on that track, you see." "No, of course not, of course not. You were on the track of Lupin," said Monsieur Formery, and his contemptuous smile was tinged with malice. The Duke looked from one to the other of them with curious, searching eyes. "I find all this so interesting," he said. "We do not take much notice of these checks. They do not depress us for a moment," said Monsieur Formery, with some return of his old grandiloquence. "We pause hardly for an instant. Then we begin to reconstruct. "It's perfectly splendid of you," said the Duke, and his limpid eyes rested on Monsieur Formery's self-satisfied face in a really affectionate gaze. They might almost be said to caress it. Guerchard looked out of the window at a man who was carrying a hodful of bricks up one of the ladders set against the scaffolding of the building house. Something in this honest workman's simple task seemed to amuse him, for he smiled. Only the inspector, thinking of the unexamined fireplace, looked really depressed. "We shan't get anything out of this woman till she wakes," said Monsieur Formery. "When she does, I shall question her closely and fully. In the meantime, she may as well be carried up to her bedroom to sleep off the effects of the chloroform." Guerchard turned quickly. "Not her own bedroom, I think," he said gently. "Certainly not, of course, not her own bedroom," said Monsieur Formery quickly. "And I think an officer at the door of whatever bedroom she does sleep in," said Guerchard. "Undoubtedly. Most necessary," said Monsieur Formery gravely. "See to it, Inspector. You can take her away." The inspector called in a couple of policemen, and with their aid he and Bonavent raised the sleeping woman, a man at each corner of the mattress, and bore her from the room. "And now, to reconstruct," said Monsieur Formery, and he folded his arms and plunged into profound reflection. The Duke and Guerchard watched him in silence. Chapter 11. The family arrives. In carrying out Victoire, the inspector had left the door of the drawing-room open. After he had watched Monsieur Formery reflect for 2 minutes, Guerchard faded, to use an expressive Americanism, through it. The Duke felt in the breast pocket of his coat, murmured softly, "My cigarettes," and followed him. He caught up Guerchard on the stairs and said, "I will come with you if I may, Monsieur Guerchard. I find all these investigations extraordinarily interesting. I have been observing Monsieur Formery's methods. I should like to watch yours for a change." "By all means," said Guerchard, and there are several things I want to hear about from your grace. Of course, it might be an advantage to discuss them together with Monsieur Formery, but—" And he hesitated. "It would be a pity to disturb Monsieur Formery in the middle of the process of reconstruction," said the Duke, and a faint, ironical smile played round the corners of his sensitive lips. Gershard looked at him quickly. "Perhaps it would," he said. They went through the house, out of the back door, and into the garden. Gershard moved about 20 yards from the house. Then he stopped and questioned the Duke at great length. He questioned him first about the Charolais, their appearance, their actions, especially about Bernard's attempt to steal the pendant and the theft of the motor cars. "I have been wondering whether Monsieur Charolais might not have been Arsène Lupin himself," said the Duke. "It's quite possible," said Gershard. "There seem to be no limits whatever to Lupin's powers of disguising himself. My colleague Ganimard has come across him at least 3 times that he knows of as a different person, and no single time could he be sure that it was the same man. Of course, he had a feeling that he was in contact with someone he had met before, but that was all. He had no certainty. He may have met him half a dozen times besides without knowing him, and the photographs of him, they're all different. Ganimard declares that Lupin is so extraordinarily successful in his disguises because he is a great actor. He actually becomes, for the time being, the person he pretends to be. He thinks and feels absolutely like that person. Do you follow me?" "Oh, yes. But he must be rather fluid, this Lupin," said the Duke, and then he added thoughtfully, "It must be awfully risky to come so often into actual contact with men like Ganimard and you." "Lupin has never let any consideration of danger prevent him doing anything that caught his fancy. He has odd fancies, too. He's a humorist of the most varied kind, grim, ironic, farcical, as the mood takes him. He must be awfully trying to live with," said Gershard. "Do you think humorists are trying to live with?" said the Duke, in a meditative tone. "I think they brighten life a good deal. But of course, there are people who do not like them. The middle classes. Yes, they're all very well in their place, but to live with they must be trying," said Gershard quickly. He went on to question the Duke closely and at length about the household of Monsieur Gournay-Martin, saying that Arsène Lupin worked with the largest gang a burglar had ever captained, and it was any odds that he had introduced one, if not more, of that gang into it. Moreover, in the case of a big affair like this, Lupin himself often played 2 or 3 parts under as many disguises. If he was Charolais, I don't see how he could be one of Monsieur Gournay-Martin's household too," said the Duke in some perplexity. "I don't say that he was Charolais," said Gershard. "It is quite a moot point. On the whole, I'm inclined to think that he was not. The theft of the motor cars was a job for a subordinate. He would hardly bother himself with it." The Duke told him all that he could remember about the millionaire's servants, and under the clever questioning of the detective, he was surprised to find how much he did remember, all kinds of odd details about them which he had scarcely been aware of observing. The 2 of them, as they talked, afforded an interesting contrast. The Duke, with his air of distinction and race, his ironic expression, his mobile features, his clear enunciation and well-modulated voice, his easy carriage of an accomplished fencer, a fencer with muscles of steel, seemed to be a man of another kind from the slow-moving detective, with his husky voice, his common, slurring enunciation, his clumsily molded features, so ill-adapted to the expression of emotion and intelligence. It was a contrast almost between the hawk and the mole, the warrior and the workman. Only in their eyes were they alike. Both of them had the keen, alert eyes of observers. Perhaps the most curious thing of all was that, in spite of the fact that he had for so much of his life been an idler, trifling away his time in the pursuit of pleasure, except when he had made his expedition to the South Pole, the Duke gave one the impression of being a cleverer man, of a far finer brain, than the detective who had spent so much of his life sharpening his wits on the more intricate problems of crime. When Gershard came to the end of his questions, the Duke said, "You have given me a very strong feeling that it is going to be a deuce of a job to catch Lupin. I don't wonder that, so far, you have none of you laid hands on him." "But we have," cried Gershard quickly. "Twice Ganimard has caught him. Once he had him in prison and actually brought him to trial. Lupin became another man and was let go from the very dock." "Really? It sounds absolutely amazing," said the Duke. And then, in the affair of the Blue Diamond, Ganimard caught him again. "He has his weakness, Lupin. It's women. It's a very common weakness in these masters of crime. Ganimard and Holmes Shears, in that affair, got the better of him by using his love for a woman, the fair-haired lady, she was called, to nab him." "A shabby trick," said the Duke. "Shabby," said Gershard, in a tone of utter wonder. "How can anything be shabby in the case of a rogue like this?" Perhaps not. Still," said the Duke, and stopped. The expression of wonder faded from Gershard's face, and he went on. "Well, Holmes Shears recovered the Blue Diamond, and Ganimard nabbed Lupin. He held him for 10 minutes. Then Lupin escaped." "What became of the fair-haired lady?" said the Duke. "I don't know. I have heard that she is dead," said Gershard. "Now I come to think of it, I heard quite definitely that she died." "It must be awful for a woman to love a man like Lupin. The constant, wearing anxiety," said the Duke thoughtfully. "I dare say. Yet he can have his pick of sweethearts. I've been offered thousands of francs by women of your Grace's world, and wealthy Viennese, to make them acquainted with Lupin," said Gershard. "You don't surprise me," said the Duke, with his ironic smile. "Women never do stop to think where one of their heroes is concerned. And did you do it?" "How could I? If I only could. If I could find Lupin entangled with a woman like Ganimard did, well," said Gershard between his teeth. "He'd never get out of your clutches," said the Duke with conviction. I think not," said Gershard grimly. "But come, I may as well get on." He walked across the turf to the foot of the ladder and looked at the footprints round it. He made but a cursory examination of them, and took his way down the garden path, out of the door in the wall, into the space about the house that was building. He was not long examining it, and he went right through it, out into the street on which the house would face when it was finished. He looked up and down it, and began to retrace his footsteps. "I've seen all I want to see out here. We may as well go back to the house," he said to the Duke. "I hope you've seen what you expected to see," said the Duke. "Exactly what I expected to see." "Exactly," said Gershard. "That's as it should be," said the Duke. They went back to the house and found Monsieur Formery in the drawing-room, still engaged in the process of reconstruction. The thing to do now is to hunt the neighborhood for witnesses of the departure of the burglars with their booty. Loaded as they were with such bulky objects, they must have had a big conveyance. Somebody must have noticed it. They must have wondered why it was standing in front of a half-built house. Somebody may have actually seen the burglars loading it, though it was so early in the morning. Bonavent had better inquire at every house in the street on which that half-built house faces. "Did you happen to notice the name of it?" said Monsieur Formery. "It's Château Street," said Gershard. "But Ducy has been hunting the neighborhood for someone who saw the burglars loading their conveyance, or saw it waiting to be loaded, for the last hour." "Good," said Monsieur Formery. "We are getting on." Monsieur Formery was silent. Gurchard and the Duke sat down and lighted cigarettes. "You found plenty of traces," said Monsieur Formery, waving his hand towards the window. "Yes, I've found plenty of traces," said Gurchard. "Of Lupin?" said Monsieur Formery, with a faint sneer. "No, not of Lupin," said Gurchard. A smile of warm satisfaction illumined Monsieur Formery's face. "What did I tell you?" he said. "I'm glad that you've changed your mind about that." "I have hardly changed my mind," said Gurchard in his husky, gentle voice. There came a loud knocking on the front door, the sound of excited voices on the stairs. The door opened, and in burst Monsieur Gournay-Martin. He took one glance round the devastated room, raised his clenched hands towards the ceiling and bellowed, "The scoundrels! The dirty scoundrels!" And his voice stuck in his throat. He tottered across the room to a couch, dropped heavily to it, gazed round the scene of desolation, and burst into tears. Germaine and Sonia came into the room. The Duke stepped forward to greet them. "Do stop crying, Papa. You're as hoarse as a crow as it is," said Germaine impatiently. Then, turning on the Duke with a frown, she said, "I think that joke of yours about the train was simply disgraceful, Jacques. A joke's a joke, but to send us out to the station on a night like last night, through all that heavy rain, when you knew all the time that there was no 9:15 train. It was simply disgraceful." "I really don't know what you're talking about," said the Duke quietly. "Wasn't there a 9:15 train?" "Of course there wasn't," said Germaine. "The timetable was years old. I think it was the most senseless attempt at a joke I ever heard of." "It doesn't seem to me to be a joke at all," said the Duke quietly. "At any rate, it isn't the kind of a joke I make. It would be detestable. I never thought to look at the date of the timetable. I keep a box of cigarettes in that drawer, and I have noticed the timetable there. Of course, it may have been lying there for years. It was stupid of me not to look at the date. I said it was a mistake. I was sure that His Grace would not do anything so unkind as that," said Sonia. The Duke smiled at her. "Well, all I can say is, it was very stupid of you not to look at the date," said Germaine. Monsieur Gournay-Martin rose to his feet and wailed in the most heart-rending fashion. "My pictures, my wonderful pictures, such investments, and my cabinets, my Renaissance cabinets, they can't be replaced. They were unique. They were worth 150,000 francs. Monsieur Formery stepped forward with an air and said, "I am distressed, Monsieur Gournay-Martin, truly distressed by your loss. I am Monsieur Formery, examining magistrate." "It is a tragedy, Monsieur Formery, a tragedy," groaned the millionaire. "Do not let it upset you too much. We shall find your masterpieces. We shall find them." "Only give us time," said Monsieur Formery in a tone of warm encouragement. The face of the millionaire brightened a little. "And after all, you have the consolation that the burglars did not get hold of the gem of your collection. They have not stolen the coronet of the Princesse de Lamballe," said Monsieur Formery. "No," said the Duke. "They have not touched this safe. It is unopened." "What has that got to do with it?" growled the millionaire quickly. "That safe is empty." "Empty? But your coronet?" cried the Duke. "Good heavens! Then they have stolen it!" cried the millionaire hoarsely, in a panic-stricken voice. "But they can't have. This safe hasn't been touched," said the Duke. "But the coronet never was in that safe. It was—" "Have they entered my bedroom?" said the millionaire. "No," said Monsieur Formery. "They don't seem to have gone through any of the rooms except these two," said the Duke. "Ah, then my mind is at rest about that. The safe in my bedroom has only 2 keys. Here is one." He took a key from his waistcoat pocket and held it out to them. "And the other is in this safe." The face of Monsieur Formerie was lighted up with a splendid satisfaction. He might have rescued the coronet with his own hands. He cried triumphantly, "There, you see." "See, see," cried the millionaire in a sudden bellow. "I see that they have robbed me, plundered me. Oh, my pictures, my wonderful pictures, such investments." Chapter 12. The Theft of the Pendant. They stood round the millionaire observing his anguish, with eyes in which shone various degrees of sympathy. As if no longer able to bear the sight of such woe, Sonia slipped out of the room. The millionaire lamented his loss and abused the thieves by turns, but always at the top of his magnificent voice. Suddenly, a fresh idea struck him. He clapped his hand to his brow and cried, "That £800? Charolais will never buy the Mercrac now. He was not a bona fide purchaser." The Duke's lips parted slightly, and his eyes opened a trifle wider than their wont. He turned sharply on his heel and almost sprang into the other drawing-room. There he laughed at his ease. Monsieur Formerie kept saying to the millionaire, "Be calm, Monsieur Gournay-Martin. Be calm. We shall recover your masterpieces. I pledge you my word. All we need is time. Have patience. Be calm." His soothing remonstrances at last had their effect. The millionaire grew calm. "Guerchard," he said. "Where is Guerchard?" Monsieur Formerie presented Guerchard to him. "Are you on their track? Have you a clue?" said the millionaire. "I think," said Monsieur Formerie in an impressive tone, "that we may now proceed with the inquiry in the ordinary way." He was a little piqued by the millionaire's so readily turning from him to the detective. He went to a writing table, set some sheets of paper before him, and prepared to make notes on the answers to his questions. The Duke came back into the drawing-room. The inspector was summoned. Monsieur Gournay-Martin sat down on a couch with his hands on his knees and gazed gloomily at Monsieur Formerie. Germaine, who was sitting on a couch near the door, waiting with an air of resignation for her father to cease his lamentations, rose and moved to a chair nearer the writing table. Guerchard kept moving restlessly about the room, but noiselessly. At last he came to a standstill, leaning against the wall behind Monsieur Formerie. Monsieur Formerie went over all the matters about which he had already questioned the Duke. He questioned the millionaire and his daughter about the Charolais, the theft of the motor cars, and the attempted theft of the pendant. He questioned them at less length about the composition of their household, the servants, and their characters. He elicited no new fact. He paused, and then he said, carelessly, as a mere matter of routine, "I should like to know, Monsieur Gournay-Martin, if there has ever been any other robbery committed at your house." 3 years ago, this scoundrel Lupin, the millionaire began violently. Yes, I know all about that earlier burglary. But have you been robbed since?" said Monsieur Formerie, interrupting him. "No, I haven't been robbed since that burglary, but my daughter has," said the millionaire. "Your daughter?" said Monsieur Formerie. "Yes, I have been robbed 2 or 3 times during the last 3 years," said Germaine. "Dear me, but you ought to have told us about this before. This is extremely interesting. And most important," said Monsieur Formerie, rubbing his hands. "I suppose you suspect Victoire?" "No, I don't," said Germaine quickly. "It couldn't have been Victoire. The last 2 thefts were committed at the château when Victoire was in Paris in charge of this house." Monsieur Formerie seemed taken aback, and he hesitated, consulting his notes. Then he said, Good. That confirms my hypothesis." "What hypothesis?" said Monsieur Gournay-Martin quickly. Never mind," said Monsieur Formerie solemnly, and turning to Germaine, he went on, "You say, mademoiselle, that these thefts began about 3 years ago." "Yes, I think they began about 3 years ago in August. Let me see. It was in the month of August 3 years ago that your father, after receiving a threatening letter, like the one he received last night, was the victim of a burglary, said Monsieur Formery. Yes, it was. The scoundrels, cried the millionaire fiercely. Well, it would be interesting to know which of your servants entered your service 3 years ago, said Monsieur Formery. Victoire has only been with us a year at the outside, said Germain. Only a year, said Monsieur Formery quickly, with an air of some vexation. He paused and added, Exactly, exactly. And what was the nature of the last theft of which you were the victim? It was a pearl brooch, not unlike the pendant which His Grace gave me yesterday, said Germain. Would you mind showing me that pendant? I should like to see it, said Monsieur Formery. Certainly, show it to him, Jacques. You have it, haven't you? Said Germain, turning to the Duke. Me? No. How should I have it? Said the Duke in some surprise. Haven't you got it? I've only got the case, the empty case, said Germain, with a startled air. The empty case? Said the Duke, with growing surprise. Yes, said Germain. It was after we came back from our useless journey to the station. I remembered suddenly that I had started without the pendant. I went to the bureau and picked up the case, and it was empty. One moment, said Monsieur Formery. Didn't you catch this young Bernard Charolais with this case in his hands, Your Grace? Yes, said the Duke. I caught him with it in his pocket. Then you may depend upon it that the young rascal had slipped the pendant out of its case, and you only recovered the empty case from him, said Monsieur Formery triumphantly. No, said the Duke. That is not so. Nor could the thief have been the burglar who broke open the bureau to get at the keys. For long after both of them were out of the house, I took a cigarette from the box which stood on the bureau beside the case which held the pendant, and it occurred to me that the young rascal might have played that very trick on me. I opened the case, and the pendant was there. It has been stolen, cried the millionaire. Of course it has been stolen. Oh, no, said the Duke. It hasn't been stolen. Irma, or perhaps Mademoiselle Krichnoff, has brought it to Paris for Germain. Sonia certainly hasn't brought it. It was she who suggested to me that you had seen it lying on the bureau and slipped it into your pocket, said Germain quickly. Then it must be Irma, said the Duke. We had better send for her and make sure, said Monsieur Formery. Inspector, go and fetch her. The inspector went out of the room, and the Duke questioned Germain and her father about the journey, whether it had been very uncomfortable, and if they were very tired by it. He learned that they had been so fortunate as to find sleeping compartments on the train, so that they had suffered as little as might be from their night of travel. Monsieur Formery looked through his notes. Gershard seemed to be going to sleep, where he stood against the wall. The inspector came back with Irma. She wore the frightened, half-defensive, half-defiant air which people of her class wear when confronted by the authorities. Her big cow's eyes rolled uneasily. Oh, Irma, Germain began. Monsieur Formery cut her short, somewhat brusquely. Excuse me, I am conducting this inquiry, he said. And then, turning to Irma, he added, Now, don't be frightened, Mademoiselle Irma. I want to ask you a question or two. Have you brought up to Paris the pendant which the Duke of Charmerace gave your mistress yesterday? Me, sir? No, sir. I haven't brought the pendant, said Irma. You are quite sure? Said Monsieur Formery. Yes, sir. I haven't seen the pendant. Didn't Mademoiselle Germain leave it on the bureau? Said Irma. How do you know that? Said Monsieur Formery. I heard Mademoiselle Germain say that it had been on the bureau. I thought that perhaps Mademoiselle Krichnoff had put it in her bag. Why should Mademoiselle Krichnoff put it in her bag? Said the Duke quickly. To bring it up to Paris for Mademoiselle Germain, said Irma. But what made you think that? Said Gershard, suddenly intervening. Oh, I thought Mademoiselle Krichnoff might have put it in her bag, because I saw her standing by the bureau, said Irma. Ah, and the pendant was on the bureau, said Monsieur Formery. Yes, sir, said Irma. There was a silence. Suddenly the atmosphere of the room seemed to have become charged with an oppression, a vague menace. Gershard seemed to have become wide awake again. Germain and the Duke looked at one another uneasily. Have you been long in the service of Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin? Said Monsieur Formery. 6 months, sir, said Irma. Very good, thank you. You can go, said Monsieur Formery. I may want you again presently. Irma went quickly out of the room with an air of relief. Monsieur Formery scribbled a few words on the paper before him, and then said, Well, I will proceed to question Mademoiselle Krichnoff. Mademoiselle Krichnoff is quite above suspicion, said the Duke quickly. Oh, yes, quite, said Germain. How long has Mademoiselle Krichnoff been in your service, mademoiselle? Said Gershard. Let me think, said Germain, knitting her brow. Can't you remember? Said Monsieur Formery. Just about 3 years, said Germain. That's exactly the time at which the thefts began, said Monsieur Formery. Yes, said Germain, reluctantly. Ask Mademoiselle Krichnoff to come here, Inspector, said Monsieur Formery. Yes, sir, said the inspector. I'll go and fetch her. I know where to find her, said the Duke quickly, moving toward the door. Please, please, Your Grace, protested Gershard. The inspector will fetch her. The Duke turned sharply and looked at him. I beg your pardon, but do you, he said. Please don't be annoyed, Your Grace, Gershard interrupted. But Monsieur Formery agrees with me. It would be quite irregular. Yes, yes, Your Grace, said Monsieur Formery. We have our method of procedure. It is best to adhere to it, much the best. It is the result of years of experience of the best way of getting the truth. Just as you please, said the Duke, shrugging his shoulders. The inspector came into the room. Mademoiselle Krichnoff will be here in a moment. She was just going out. She was going out, said Monsieur Formery. You don't mean to say you're letting members of the household go out? No, sir, said the inspector. I mean that she was just asking if she might go out. Monsieur Formery beckoned the inspector to him and said to him in a voice too low for the others to hear, Just slip up to her room and search her trunks. There is no need to take the trouble, said Gershard, in the same low voice, but with sufficient emphasis. No, of course not. There's no need to take the trouble, Monsieur Formery repeated after him. The door opened, and Sonia came in. She was still wearing her traveling costume, and she carried her cloak on her arm. She stood looking round her, with an air of some surprise. Perhaps there was even a touch of fear in it. The long journey of the night before did not seem to have dimmed at all her delicate beauty. The Duke's eyes rested on her in an inquiring, wondering, even searching gaze. She looked at him, and her own eyes fell. Will you come a little nearer, mademoiselle? Said Monsieur Formery. There are 1 or 2 questions. Will you allow me? Said Gershard, in a tone of such deference that it left Monsieur Formery no grounds for refusal. Monsieur Formery flushed and ground his teeth. Have it your own way, he said ungraciously. Mademoiselle Krichnoff, said Gershard, in a tone of the most good-natured courtesy, there is a matter on which Monsieur Formery needs some information. The pendant, which the Duke of Charmerace gave Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin yesterday, has been stolen. Stolen? Are you sure? Said Sonia in a tone of mingled surprise and anxiety. Quite sure, said Gershard. We have exactly determined the conditions under which the theft was committed, but we have every reason to believe that the culprit, to avoid detection, has hidden the pendant in the traveling bag or trunk of somebody else, in order to— My bag is upstairs in my bedroom, sir, Sonia interrupted quickly. Here is the key of it. In order to free her hands to take the key from her wrist bag, she set her cloak on the back of a couch. It slipped off it and fell to the ground at the feet of the Duke, who had not returned to his place beside Germaine. While she was groping in her bag for the key and all eyes were on her, the Duke, who had watched her with a curious intentness ever since her entry into the room, stooped quietly down and picked up the cloak. His hand slipped into the pocket of it. His fingers touched a hard object wrapped in tissue paper. They closed round it, drew it from the pocket, and, sheltered by the cloak, transferred it to his own. He set the cloak on the back of the sofa and very softly moved back to his place by Germaine's side. No one in the room observed the movement, not even Gershard. He was watching Sonia too intently. Sonia found the key and held it out to Gershard. He shook his head and said, "There is no reason to search your bag, none whatever. Have you any other luggage?" She shrank back a little from his piercing eyes, almost as if their gaze scared her. "Yes, my trunk. It's upstairs in my bedroom too. Open." She spoke in a faltering voice, and her troubled eyes could not meet those of the detective. "You were going out, I think," said Gershard gently. "I was asking leave to go out. There is some shopping that must be done," said Sonia. "You do not see any reason why Mademoiselle Krichnoff should not go out, Monsieur Formery, do you?" said Gershard. "Oh no, none whatever. Of course she can go out," said Monsieur Formery. Sonia turned round to go. "One moment," said Gershard, coming forward. "You've only got that wrist bag with you?" "Yes," said Sonia. "I have my money and my handkerchief in it." And she held it out to him. Gershard's keen eyes darted into it, and he muttered, "No point in looking in that. I don't suppose anyone would have had the audacity—" And he stopped. Sonia made a couple of steps toward the door, turned, hesitated, came back to the couch, and picked up her cloak. There was a sudden gleam in Gershard's eyes, a gleam of understanding, expectation, and triumph. He stepped forward and, holding out his hands, said, "Allow me." "No, thank you," said Sonia. "I'm not going to put it on." "No, but it's possible. Someone may have— Have you felt in the pockets of it? That one now. It seems as if that one—" He pointed to the pocket which had held the packet. Sonia started back with an air of utter dismay. Her eyes glanced wildly round the room as if seeking an avenue of escape. Her fingers closed convulsively on the pocket. "But this is abominable!" she cried. "You look as if—" "I beg you, mademoiselle," interrupted Gershard. "We are sometimes obliged." "Really, Mademoiselle Sonia," broke in the Duke in a singularly clear and piercing tone, "I cannot see why you should object to this mere formality." "Oh, but—" gasped Sonia, raising her terror-stricken eyes to his. The Duke seemed to hold them with his own, and he said in the same clear, piercing voice, "There isn't the slightest reason for you to be frightened." Sonia let go of the cloak, and Gershard, his face all alight with triumph, plunged his hand into the pocket. He drew it out empty and stared at it, while his face fell to an utter amazed blankness. "Nothing, nothing," he muttered under his breath, and he stared at his empty hand as if he could not believe his eyes. By a violent effort, he forced an apologetic smile on his face and said to Sonia, "1,000 apologies, mademoiselle." He handed the cloak to her. Sonia took it and turned to go. She took a step towards the door and tottered. The Duke sprang forward and caught her as she was falling. "Do you feel faint?" he said in an anxious voice. "Thank you. You just saved me in time," muttered Sonia. "I'm really very sorry," said Guerchard. "Thank you, it was nothing." "I'm all right now," said Sonia, releasing herself from the Duke's supporting arm. She drew herself up and walked quietly out of the room. Guerchard went back to Monsieur Formery at the writing table. "You made a clumsy mistake there, Guerchard," said Monsieur Formery, with a touch of gratified malice in his tone. Guerchard took no notice of it. "I want you to give orders that nobody leaves the house without my permission," he said in a low voice. "No one except Mademoiselle Krichnoff, I suppose," said Monsieur Formery, smiling. "She less than anyone," said Guerchard quickly. "I don't understand what you're driving at a bit," said Monsieur Formery, "unless you suppose that Mademoiselle Krichnoff is Lupin in disguise." Guerchard laughed softly. "You will have your joke, Monsieur Formery," he said. "Well, well, I'll give the order," said Monsieur Formery, somewhat mollified by the tribute to his humour. He called the inspector to him and whispered a word in his ear. Then he rose and said, "I think, gentlemen, we ought to go and examine the bedrooms, and above all, make sure that the safe in Monsieur Gournay-Martin's bedroom has not been tampered with." "I was wondering how much longer we were going to waste time here talking about that stupid pendant," grumbled the millionaire, and he rose and led the way. "There may also be some jewel cases in the bedrooms," said Monsieur Formery. "There are all the wedding presents. They were in charge of Victoire," said Germain quickly. "It would be dreadful if they had been stolen. Some of them are from the first families in France." "They would replace them." "Those paper knives," said the Duke, smiling. Germain and her father led the way. Monsieur Formery, Guerchard, and the inspector followed them. At the door, the Duke paused, stopped, closed it on them softly. He came back to the window, put his hand in his pocket, and drew out the packet, wrapped in tissue paper. He unfolded the paper with slow, reluctant fingers, and revealed the pendant. Chapter 13. Lupin Wires. The Duke stared at the pendant, his eyes full of wonder and pity. "Poor little girl," he said softly under his breath. He put the pendant carefully away in his waistcoat pocket and stood staring thoughtfully out of the window. The door opened softly, and Sonia came quickly into the room, closed the door, and leaned back against it. Her face was a dead white. Her skin had lost its luster of fine porcelain, and she stared at him with eyes dim with anguish. In a hoarse, broken voice, she muttered, "Forgive me. Oh, forgive me." "A thief? You?" said the Duke, in a tone of pitying wonder. Sonia groaned. "You mustn't stop here," said the Duke in an uneasy tone, and he looked uneasily at the door. "Ah, you don't want to speak to me any more," said Sonia in a heart-rending tone, wringing her hands. "Guerchard is suspicious of everything. It is dangerous for us to be talking here." "I assure you that it's dangerous," said the Duke. "What an opinion must you have of me? It's dreadful, cruel," wailed Sonia. "For goodness' sake, don't speak so loud," said the Duke, with even greater uneasiness. "You must think of Guerchard." "What do I care?" cried Sonia. "I've lost the liking of the only creature whose liking I wanted. What does anything else matter? What does it matter?" "We'll talk somewhere else presently. That'll be far safer," said the Duke. "No, no, we must talk now," cried Sonia. "You must know. I must tell. Oh dear, I don't know how to tell you. And then it is so unfair. Germain, she has everything," she panted. "Yesterday, before me, you gave her that pendant." She smiled. She was proud of it. I saw her pleasure. Then I took it. I took it. I took it. And if I could, I'd take her fortune too. I hate her. Oh, how I hate her. What? Said the Duke. Yes, I do. I hate her, said Sonia, and her eyes, no longer gentle, glowed with the somber resentment, the dull rage of the weak who turn on fortune. Her gentle voice was harsh with rebellious wrath. You hate her? Said the Duke quickly. I should never have told you that. But now I dare speak out. It's you. It's you. The avowal died on her lips. A burning flush crimsoned her cheeks and faded as quickly as it came. I hate her, she muttered. Sonia, said the Duke gently. Oh, I know that it's no excuse. I know that you're thinking, this is a very pretty story, but it's not her first theft. And it's true. It's the 10th. Perhaps it's the 20th. It's true. I am a thief. She paused, and the glow deepened in her eyes. But there's one thing you must believe, you shall believe. Since you came, since I've known you, since the first day you set eyes on me, I have stolen no more. Till yesterday when you gave her the pendant before me, I could not bear it. I could not. She paused and looked at him with eyes that demanded an assent. I believe you, said the Duke gravely. She heaved a deep sigh of relief and went on more quietly. Some of its golden tone had returned to her voice. And then, if you knew how it began, the horror of it, she said. Poor child, said the Duke softly. Yes, you pity me, but you despise me. You despise me beyond words. You shall not. I will not have it, she cried fiercely. Believe me, no, said the Duke in a soothing tone. Listen, said Sonia. Have you ever been alone? Alone in the world? Have you ever been hungry? Think of it, in this big city where I was starving in sight of bread. Bread in the shops. One only had to stretch out one's hand to touch it. A penny loaf. Oh, it's commonplace, she broke off. Quite commonplace. Go on, tell me, said the Duke curtly. There was one way I could make money, and I would not do it. No, I would not, she went on. But that day, I was dying. Understand, I was dying. I went to the rooms of a man I knew a little. It was my last resource. At first, I was glad. He gave me food and wine. And then, he talked to me. He offered me money. What? Cried the Duke, and a sudden flame of anger flared up in his eyes. No, I could not. And then I robbed him. I preferred to. It was more decent. I had excuses then. I began to steal to remain an honest woman, and I've gone on stealing to keep up appearances. You see, I joke about it. And she laughed, the faint, dreadful, mocking laugh of a damned soul. Oh dear, she cried, and burying her face in her hands, she burst into a storm of weeping. Poor child, said the Duke softly, and he stared gloomily on the ground, overcome by this revelation of the tortures of the feeble. In the underworld beneath the Paris, he knew. Oh, you do pity me. You do understand and feel, said Sonia, between her sobs. The Duke raised his head and gazed at her with eyes full of an infinite sympathy and compassion. Poor little Sonia, he said gently. I understand. She gazed at him with incredulous eyes, in which joy and despair mingled, struggling. He came slowly towards her and stopped short. His quick ear had caught the sound of a footstep outside the door. Quick, dry your eyes. You must look composed. The other room, he cried in an imperative tone. He caught her hand and drew her swiftly into the further drawing room. With the quickness which came of long practice in hiding her feelings, Sonia composed her face to something of its usual gentle calm. There was even a faint tinge of color in her cheeks. They had lost their dead whiteness. A faint light shone in her eyes. The anguish had cleared from them. They rested on the Duke with a look of ineffable gratitude. She sat down on a couch. The Duke went to the window and lighted a cigarette. They heard the door of the outer drawing-room open, and there was a pause. Quick footsteps crossed the room, and Gershard stood in the doorway. He looked from one to the other with keen and eager eyes. Sonia sat staring rather listlessly at the carpet. The Duke turned and smiled at him. "Well, Monsieur Gershard," he said, "I hope the burglars have not stolen the coronet." "The coronet is safe, Your Grace," said Gershard. "And the paper knives?" said the Duke. "The paper knives," said Gershard, with an inquiring air. "The wedding presents?" said the Duke. "Yes, Your Grace, the wedding presents are safe," said Gershard. "I breathe again," said the Duke languidly. Gershard turned to Sonia and said, "I was looking for you, mademoiselle, to tell you that Monsieur Formerie has changed his mind. It is impossible for you to go out. No one will be allowed to go out." "Yes," said Sonia in an indifferent tone. "We should be very much obliged if you would go to your room," said Gershard. "Your meals will be sent up to you." "What?" said Sonia, rising quickly, and she looked from Gershard to the Duke. The Duke gave her the faintest nod. "Very well, I will go to my room," she said coldly. They accompanied her to the door of the outer drawing-room. Gershard opened it for her and closed it after her. "Really, Monsieur Gershard," said the Duke, shrugging his shoulders, "this last measure, a child like that. Really, I'm very sorry, Your Grace, but it's my trade, or if you prefer it, my duty. As long as things are taking place here, which I am still the only one to perceive, and which are not yet clear to me, I must neglect no precaution." "Of course you know best," said the Duke, "but still, a child like that, you're frightening her out of her life." Gershard shrugged his shoulders and went quietly out of the room. The Duke sat down in an easy chair, frowning and thoughtful. Suddenly, there struck on his ears the sound of a loud roaring and heavy bumping on the stairs. The door flew open, and Monsieur Gurney-Martin stood on the threshold, waving a telegram in his hand. Monsieur Formerie and the inspector came hurrying down the stairs behind him, and watched his emotion with astonished and wondering eyes. "Here," bellowed the millionaire, "a telegram! A telegram from the scoundrel himself. Listen, just listen. 1,000 apologies for not having been able to keep my promise about the coronet. Had an appointment at the Acacias. Please have coronet ready in your room tonight. Will come without fail to fetch it, between 11:45 and 12 o'clock. Yours affectionately, Arsène Lupin." There, what do you think of that? "If you ask me, I think he's humbug," said the Duke with conviction. "Humbug! You always think it's humbug. You thought the letter was humbug. And look what has happened," cried the millionaire. "Give me the telegram, please," said Monsieur Formerie quickly. The millionaire gave it to him, and he read it through. "Find out who brought it, Inspector," he said. The inspector hurried to the top of the staircase and called to the policeman in charge of the front door. He came back to the drawing-room and said, "It was brought by an ordinary post office messenger, sir." "Where is he?" said Monsieur Formerie. "Why did you let him go?" "Shall I send for him, sir?" said the inspector. No, it doesn't matter," said Monsieur Formerie, and turning to Monsieur Gurney-Martin and the Duke, he said, "Now we're really going to have trouble with Gershard. He is going to muddle up everything. This telegram will be the last straw. Nothing will persuade him now that this is not Lupin's work. And just consider, gentlemen, if Lupin had come last night, and if he had really set his heart on the coronet, he would have stolen it then, or at any rate, he would have tried to open the safe in Monsieur Gournay-Martin's bedroom, in which the coronet actually is, or this safe here. He went to the safe and rapped on the door of it, in which is the second key. "That's quite clear," said the inspector. "If, then, he did not make the attempt last night, when he had a clear field, when the house was empty, he certainly will not make the attempt now, when we are warned, when the police are on the spot, and the house is surrounded. The idea is childish, gentlemen." He leaned against the door of the safe. "Absolutely childish. But Gershard is mad on this point, and I foresee that his madness is going to hamper us in the most idiotic way." He suddenly pitched forward into the middle of the room as the door of the safe opened with a jerk, and Gershard shot out of it. "What the devil?" cried Monsieur Formery, gaping at him. "You'd be surprised how clearly you hear everything in these safes. You'd think they were too thick," said Gershard in his gentle, husky voice. "How on earth did you get into it?" cried Monsieur Formery. "Getting in was easy enough. It's the getting out that was awkward. These jokers had fixed up some kind of a spring, so that I nearly shot out with the door," said Gershard, rubbing his elbow. "But how did you get into it? How the deuce did you get into it?" cried Monsieur Formery. "Through the little cabinet into which that door behind the safe opens. There's no longer any back to the safe. They've cut it clean out of it. A very neat piece of work. Safes like this should always be fixed against a wall, not stuck in front of a door. The backs of them are always the weak point. And the key of the safe upstairs, in my bedroom, where the coronet is the key there?" cried Monsieur Gournay-Martin. Gershard went back into the empty safe and groped about in it. He came out smiling. "Well, have you found the key?" cried the millionaire. "No, I haven't, but I've found something better," said Gershard. "What is it?" said Monsieur Formery sharply. "I'll give you 100 guesses," said Gershard with a tantalizing smile. "What is it?" said Monsieur Formery. "A little present for you," said Gershard. "What do you mean?" cried Monsieur Formery angrily. Gershard held up a card between his thumb and forefinger and said quietly, "The card of Arsène Lupin." Chapter 14. Gershard picks up the true scent. The millionaire gazed at the card with stupefied eyes. The inspector gazed at it with extreme intelligence. The Duke gazed at it with interest, and Monsieur Formery gazed at it with extreme disgust. "It's part of the same ruse. It was put there to throw us off the scent. It proves nothing. Absolutely nothing," he said scornfully. "No, it proves nothing at all," said Gershard quietly. "The telegram is the important thing. This telegram," said Monsieur Gournay-Martin feverishly. "It concerns the coronet. Is it going to be disregarded?" "Oh, no, no," said Monsieur Formery in a soothing tone. "It will be taken into account. It will certainly be taken into account." Monsieur Gournay-Martin's butler appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room. "If you please, sir, lunch is served," he said. At the tidings, some of his weight of woe appeared to be lifted from the head of the millionaire. "Good," he said, "good. Gentlemen, you will lunch with me, I hope." "Thank you," said Monsieur Formery. "There is nothing else for us to do, at any rate at present, and in the house. I am not quite satisfied about Mademoiselle Kritchnoff. At least Gershard is not. I propose to question her again about those earlier thefts." "I'm sure there's nothing in that," said the Duke quickly. "No, no, I don't think there is," said Monsieur Formery. "But still, one never knows from what quarter light may come in an affair like this. Accident often gives us our best clues." "It seems rather a shame to frighten her. She's such a child," said the Duke. "Oh, I shall be gentle, Your Grace, as gentle as possible, that is. but I look to get more from the examination of Victoire. She was on the scene. She has actually seen the rogues at work. But till she recovers, there is nothing more to be done, except to wait the discoveries of the detectives who are working outside, and they will report here. So, in the meantime, we shall be charmed to lunch with you, Monsieur Gournay-Martin." They went downstairs to the dining room and found an elaborate and luxurious lunch, worthy of the hospitality of a millionaire, awaiting them. The skill of the cook seemed to have been quite unaffected by the losses of his master. Monsieur Formerie, an ardent lover of good things, enjoyed himself immensely. He was in the highest spirits. Germaine, a little upset by the night journey, was rather querulous. Her father was plunged in a gloom, which lifted for but a brief space at the appearance of a fresh delicacy. Gershard ate and drank seriously, answering the questions of the Duke in a somewhat absent-minded fashion. The Duke himself seemed to have lost his usual flow of good spirits, and at times his brow was knitted in an anxious frown. His questions to Gershard showed a far less keen interest in the affair. To him the lunch seemed very long and very tedious, but at last it came to an end. Monsieur Gournay-Martin seemed to have been much cheered by the wine he had drunk. He was almost hopeful. Monsieur Formerie, who had not by any means trifled with the champagne, was raised to the very height of sanguine certainty. Their coffee and liqueurs were served in the smoking room. Gershard lighted a cigar, refused a liqueur, drank his coffee quickly, and slipped out of the room. The Duke followed him, and in the hall said, "I will continue to watch you unravel the threads of this mystery, if I may, Monsieur Gershard." Good Republican as Gershard was, he could not help feeling flattered by the interest of a duke, and the excellent lunch he had eaten disposed him to feel the honor even more deeply. "I shall be charmed," he said. "To tell the truth, I find the company of your Grace really quite stimulating." "It must be because I find it also extremely interesting," said the Duke. They went up to the drawing-room and found the red-faced young policeman seated on a chair by the door eating a lunch, which had been sent up to him from the millionaire's kitchen with a very hearty appetite. They went into the drawing-room. Gershard shut the door and turned the key. "Now," he said, "I think that Monsieur Formerie will give me half an hour to myself. His cigar ought to last him at least half an hour. In that time, I shall know what the burglars really did with their plunder. At least, I shall know for certain how they got it out of the house." "Please explain," said the Duke. "I thought we knew how they got it out of the house." And he waved his hand towards the window. "Oh, that's childish," said Gershard contemptuously. "Those are traces for an examining magistrate. The ladder, the table on the window-sill, they lead nowhere. The only people who came up that ladder were the two men who brought it from the scaffolding. You can see their footsteps. Nobody went down it at all. It was mere waste of time to bother with those traces." "But the footprint under the book," said the Duke. "Oh, that," said Gershard. "One of the burglars sat on the couch there, rubbed plaster on the sole of his boot, and set his foot down on the carpet. Then he dusted the rest of the plaster off his boot and put the book on the top of the footprint." "Now, how do you know that?" said the astonished Duke. "It's as plain as a pikestaff," said Gershard. "There must have been several burglars to move such pieces of furniture. If the soles of all of them had been covered with plaster, all the sweeping in the world would not have cleared the carpet of the tiny fragments of it. I've been over the carpet between the footprint and the window with a magnifying glass. There are no fragments of plaster on it. We dismiss the footprint. It is a mere blind, and a very fair blind too, for an examining magistrate." "I understand," said the Duke. "That narrows the problem, the quite simple problem. How was the furniture taken out of the room? It did not go through that window, down the ladder. Again, it was not taken down the stairs and out of the front door or the back. If it had been, the concierge and his wife would have heard the noise. Besides that, it would have been carried down into a main street, in which there are people at all hours. Somebody would have been sure to tell a policeman that this house was being emptied. Moreover, the police were continually patrolling the main streets, and quickly as a man like Lupin would do the job, he could not do it so quickly that a policeman would not have seen it. No, the furniture was not taken down the stairs or out of the front door. That narrows the problem still more. In fact, there is only one mode of egress left. "The chimney!" cried the Duke. "You've hit it," said Gershard, with a husky laugh. "By that well-known logical process, the process of elimination, we've excluded all methods of egress except the chimney." He paused, frowning in some perplexity, and then he said, uneasily, "What I don't like about it is that Victoire was set in the fireplace. I asked myself at once, what was she doing there? It was unnecessary that she should be drugged and set in the fireplace. Quite unnecessary." "It might have been to put off an examining magistrate," said the Duke. "Having found Victoire in the fireplace, Monsieur Formerie did not look for anything else." "Yes, it might have been that," said Gershard slowly. "On the other hand, she might have been put there to make sure that I did not miss the road the burglars took. That's the worst of having to do with Lupin. He knows me to the bottom of my mind. He has something up his sleeve, some surprise for me. Even now, I'm nowhere near the bottom of the mystery. But come along. We'll take the road the burglars took. The inspector has put my lantern ready for me." As he spoke, he went to the fireplace, picked up a lantern which had been set on the top of the iron fire basket, and lighted it. The Duke stepped into the great fireplace beside him. It was 4 feet deep, and between 8 and 9 feet broad. Gershard threw the light from the lantern onto the back wall of it. 6 feet from the floor, the soot from the fire stopped abruptly, and there was a dappled patch of bricks, half of them clean and red, half of them blackened by soot, 5 feet broad and 4 feet high. "The opening is higher up than I thought," said Gershard. "I must get a pair of steps." He went to the door of the drawing-room and bade the young policeman fetch him a pair of steps. They were brought quickly. He took them from the policeman, shut the door, and locked it again. He set the steps in the fireplace and mounted them. "Be careful," he said to the Duke, who had followed him into the fireplace and stood at the foot of the steps. "Some of these bricks may drop inside, and they'll sting you up if they fall on your toes." The Duke stepped back out of reach of any bricks that might fall. Gershard set his left hand against the wall of the chimney-piece between him and the drawing-room and pressed hard with his right against the top of the dappled patch of bricks. At the first push, half a dozen of them fell with a bang onto the floor of the next house. The light came flooding in through the hole and shone on Gershard's face and its smile of satisfaction. Quickly he pushed row after row of bricks into the next house until he had cleared an opening 4 feet square. "Come along," he said to the Duke, and disappeared feet foremost through the opening. The Duke mounted the steps and found himself looking into a large, empty room of the exact size and shape of the drawing-room of Monsieur Gournay-Martin, save that it had an ordinary modern fireplace instead of one of the antique pattern of that in which he stood. Its chimney-piece was a few inches below the opening. He stepped out onto the chimney-piece and dropped lightly to the floor. "Well," he said, looking back at the opening through which he had come, "that's an ingenious dodge." "Oh, it's common enough," said Gershard. "Robberies at the big jewelers are sometimes worked by these means, but what is uncommon about it, and what at first sight put me off the track, is that these burglars had the cheek to pierce the wall with an opening large enough to enable them to remove the furniture of a house. "It's true," said the Duke. "The opening's as large as a good-sized window. Those burglars seem capable of everything, even of a first-class piece of mason's work. Oh, this has all been prepared a long while ago, but now I'm really on their track, and after all, I haven't really lost any time. Ducey wasted no time in making inquiries in Sureau Street. He's been working all this side of the house." Gershard drew up the blinds, opened the shutters, and let the daylight flood the dim room. He came back to the fireplace and looked down at the heap of bricks, frowning. "I made a mistake there," he said. "I ought to have taken those bricks down carefully, one by one." Quickly, he took brick after brick from the pile and began to range them neatly against the wall on the left. The Duke watched him for 2 or 3 minutes, then began to help him. It did not take them long, and under one of the last few bricks, Gershard found a fragment of a gilded picture frame. "Here's where they ought to have done their sweeping," he said, holding it up to the Duke. "I tell you what," said the Duke, "I shouldn't wonder if we found the furniture in this house still." "Oh, no, no," said Gershard. "I tell you that Lupin would allow for myself or Ganimard being put in charge of the case, and he would know that we should find the opening in the chimney. The furniture was taken straight out into the side street onto which this house opens. He led the way out of the room, onto the landing, and went down the dark staircase into the hall. He opened the shutters of the hall windows and let in the light. Then he examined the hall. The dust lay thick on the tiled floor. Down the middle of it was a lane formed by many feet. The footprints were faint, but still plain in the layer of dust. Gershard came back to the stairs and began to examine them. Halfway up the flight, he stooped and picked up a little spray of flowers. "Fresh," he said. "These have not been long plucked." "Salvias," said the Duke. "Salvias they are," said Gershard. "Pink salvias, and there is only one gardener in France who has ever succeeded in getting this shade, Monsieur Gournay Martin's gardener at Charmerace. I'm a gardener myself." "Well then, last night's burglars came from Charmerace. They must have," said the Duke. "It looks like it," said Gershard. "The Charolais," said the Duke. "It looks like it," said Gershard. "It must be," said the Duke. "This is interesting. If only we could get an absolute proof." "We shall get one presently," said Gershard confidently. "It is interesting," said the Duke, in a tone of lively enthusiasm. "These clues, these tracks which cross one another, each fact by degrees, falling into its proper place, extraordinarily interesting." He paused and took out his cigarette case. "Will you have a cigarette?" he said. "Are they Caporal?" said Gershard. "No, Egyptians. Mercedes." "Thank you," said Gershard, and he took one. The Duke struck a match, lighted Gershard's cigarette, and then his own. "Yes, it's very interesting," he said. "In the last quarter of an hour, you've practically discovered that the burglars came from Charmerace, that they were the Charolais, that they came in by the front door of this house and carried the furniture out of it." "I don't know about their coming in by it," said Gershard. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, they came in by the front door of Monsieur Gournay Martin's house." "Of course," said the Duke. "I was forgetting. They brought the keys from Charmerace." "Yes, but who drew the bolts for them?" said Gershard. "The concierge bolted them before he went to bed. He told me so. He was telling the truth. I know when that kind of man is telling the truth." "By Jove," said the Duke softly. "You mean that they had an accomplice?" "I think we shall find that they had an accomplice. but your grace is beginning to draw inferences with uncommon quickness. I believe that you would make a first-class detective yourself. With practice, of course, with practice. Can I have missed my true career? Said the Duke, smiling. It's certainly a very interesting game. Well, I'm not going to search this barracks myself, said Gershard. I'll send in a couple of men to do it, but I'll just take a look at the steps myself. So saying, he opened the front door and went out and examined the steps carefully. We shall have to go back the way we came, he said, when he had finished his examination. The drawing-room door is locked. We ought to find Monsieur Formery hammering on it. And he smiled as if he found the thought pleasing. They went back up the stairs, through the opening, into the drawing-room of Monsieur Gournay-Martin's house. Sure enough, from the other side of the locked door came the excited voice of Monsieur Formery, crying, "Gershard! Gershard! What are you doing? Let me in! Why don't you let me in?" Gershard unlocked the door, and in bounced Monsieur Formery, very excited, very red in the face. "Hang it all, Gershard! What on earth have you been doing?" he cried. "Why didn't you open the door when I knocked?" "I didn't hear you," said Gershard. "I wasn't in the room." "Then where on earth have you been?" cried Monsieur Formery. Gershard looked at him with a faint ironical smile and said in his gentle voice, "I was following the real track of the burglars." Chapter 15. The Examination of Sonia. Monsieur Formery gasped. "The real track?" he muttered. "Let me show you," said Gershard, and he led him to the fireplace and showed him the opening between the two houses. "I must go into this myself," cried Monsieur Formery in wild excitement. Without more ado, he began to mount the steps. Gershard followed him. The Duke saw their heels disappear up the steps. Then he came out of the drawing-room and inquired for Monsieur Gournay-Martin. He was told that the millionaire was up in his bedroom, and he went upstairs and knocked at the door of it. Monsieur Gournay-Martin bade him enter in a very faint voice, and the Duke found him lying on the bed. He was looking depressed, even exhausted, the shadow of the blusterous Gournay-Martin of the day before. The rich rosiness of his cheeks had faded to a moderate rose pink. "That telegram," moaned the millionaire. "It was the last straw. It has overwhelmed me. The coronet is lost." "What, already?" said the Duke, in a tone of the liveliest surprise. "No, no, it's still in the safe," said the millionaire, "but it's as good as lost. Before midnight, it will be lost. That fiend will get it." "If it's in this safe now, it won't be lost before midnight," said the Duke. "But are you sure it's there now?" "Look for yourself," said the millionaire, taking the key of the safe from his waistcoat pocket and handing it to the Duke. The Duke opened the safe. The morocco case which held the coronet lay on the middle shell in front of him. He glanced at the millionaire and saw that he had closed his eyes in the exhaustion of despair. Whistling softly, the Duke opened the case, took out the diadem, and examined it carefully, admiring its admirable workmanship. He put it back in the case, turned to the millionaire, and said thoughtfully, "I can never make up my mind, in the case of one of these old diadems, whether one ought not to take out the stones and have them recut. Look at this emerald now. It's a very fine stone, but this old-fashioned cutting does not really do it justice. Oh, no, no, you should never interfere with an antique, historic piece of jewelry. Any alteration decreases its value as an historic relic," cried the millionaire in a shocked tone. "I know that," said the Duke, "but the question for me is whether one ought not to sacrifice some of its value to increasing its beauty." "You do have such mad ideas," said the millionaire in a tone of peevish exasperation. "Ah, well, it's a nice question," said the Duke. He snapped the case briskly, put it back on the shelf, locked the safe, and handed the key to the millionaire. Then he strolled across the room and looked down into the street, whistling softly. I think I'll go home and get out of these motoring clothes, and I should like to have on a pair of boots that were a trifle less muddy," he said slowly. Monsieur Gournay-Martin sat up with a jerk and cried, "For heaven's sake, don't you go and desert me, my dear chap. You don't know what my nerves are like." "Oh, you've got that sleuth-hound, Gershard, and the splendid Formery, and 4 other detectives, and half a dozen ordinary policemen guarding you. You can do without my feeble arm. Besides, I shan't be gone more than half an hour. 3/4 at the outside. I'll bring back my evening clothes with me and dress for dinner here. I don't suppose that anything fresh will happen between now and midnight. But I want to be on the spot and hear the information as it comes in fresh. Besides, there's Gershard. I positively cling to Gershard. It's an education, though perhaps not a liberal education, to go about with him," said the Duke, and there was a subacid irony in his voice. "Well, if you must, you must," said Monsieur Gournay-Martin grumpily. "Goodbye for the present, then," said the Duke, and he went out of the room and down the stairs. He took his motor cap from the hall table and had his hand on the latch of the door when the policeman in charge of it said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but have you Monsieur Gershard's permission to leave the house?" "Monsieur Gershard's permission?" said the Duke haughtily. "What has Monsieur Gershard to do with me? I am the Duke of Charmerace." And he opened the door. "It was Monsieur Formery's orders, Your Grace," stammered the policeman doubtfully. "Monsieur Formery's orders?" said the Duke, standing on the top step. "Call me a taxicab, please." The concierge, who stood beside the policeman, ran down the steps and blew his whistle. The policeman gazed uneasily at the Duke, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but he said no more. A taxicab came up to the door. The Duke went down the steps, stepped into it, and drove away. 3/4 of an hour later, he came back, having changed into clothes more suited to a Paris drawing-room. He went up to the drawing-room, and there he found Gershard, Monsieur Formery, and the inspector, who had just completed their tour of inspection of the house next door and had satisfied themselves that the stolen treasures were not in it. The inspector and his men had searched it thoroughly, just to make sure, but as Gershard had foretold, the burglars had not taken the chance of the failure of the police to discover the opening between the 2 houses. Monsieur Formery told the Duke about their tour of inspection at length. Gershard went to the telephone and told the exchange to put him through to Charmerace. He was informed that the trunk line was very busy and that he might have to wait half an hour. The Duke inquired if any trace of the burglars, after they had left with their booty, had yet been found. Monsieur Formery told him that so far the detectives had failed to find a single trace. Gershard said that he had 3 men at work on the search, and that he was hopeful of getting some news before long. "The layman is impatient in these matters," said Monsieur Formery, with an indulgent smile, "but we have learnt to be patient after long experience." He proceeded to discuss with Gershard the new theories with which the discovery of the afternoon had filled his mind. None of them struck the Duke as being of great value, and he listened to them with a somewhat absent-minded air. The coming examination of Sonia weighed heavily on his spirit. Gershard answered only in monosyllables to the questions and suggestions thrown out by Monsieur Formery. It seemed to the Duke that he paid very little attention to him, that his mind was still working hard on the solution of the mystery, seeking the missing facts which would bring him to the bottom of it. In the middle of one of Monsieur Formery's more elaborate dissertations, the telephone bell rang. Gershard rose hastily and went to it. They heard him say, "Is that Charmerace? I want the gardener. Out? When will he be back? Tell him to ring me up at Monsieur Gournay-Martin's house in Paris the moment he gets back. Detective Inspector Gershard. Gershard, Detective Inspector." He turned to them with a frown and said, "Of course, since I want him, the confounded gardener has gone out for the day. Still, it's of very little importance, a mere corroboration I wanted." And he went back to his seat and lighted another cigarette. Monsieur Formerie continued his dissertation. Presently, Gershard said, "You might go and see how Victoire is, Inspector, whether she shows any signs of waking. What did the doctor say?" "The doctor said that she would not really be sensible and have her full wits about her much before 10 o'clock tonight," said the inspector, "but he went to examine her present condition." Monsieur Formerie proceeded to discuss the effects of different anesthetics. The others heard him with very little attention. The inspector came back and reported that Victoire showed no signs of awaking. "Well then, Monsieur Formerie, I think we might get on with the examination of Mademoiselle Krichnoff," said Gershard. "Will you go and fetch her, Inspector?" "Really, I cannot conceive why you should worry that poor child," the Duke protested in a tone of some indignation. "It seems to me hardly necessary," said Monsieur Formerie. "Excuse me," said Gershard suavely, "but I attach considerable importance to it. It seems to me to be our bounden duty to question her fully. One never knows from what quarter light may come." "Oh, well, since you make such a point of it," said Monsieur Formerie, "Inspector, ask Mademoiselle Krichnoff to come here. Fetch her." The inspector left the room. Gershard looked at the Duke with a faint air of uneasiness. "I think that we had better question Mademoiselle Krichnoff by ourselves," he said. Monsieur Formerie looked at him and hesitated. Then he said, "Oh, yes, of course, by ourselves." "Certainly," said the Duke, a trifle haughtily, and he rose and opened the door. He was just going through it when Gershard said sharply, "Your Grace." The Duke paid no attention to him. He shut the door quickly behind him and sprang swiftly up the stairs. He met the inspector coming down with Sonia. Barring their way for a moment, he said, in his kindliest voice, "Now, you mustn't be frightened, Mademoiselle Sonia. All you have to do is to try to remember as clearly as you can the circumstances of the earlier thefts at Charmerace. You mustn't let them confuse you." "Thank you, Your Grace. I will try and be as clear as I can," said Sonia. And she gave him an eloquent glance, full of gratitude for the warning, and went down the stairs with firm steps. The Duke went on up the stairs and knocked softly at the door of Monsieur Gournay-Martin's bedroom. There was no answer to his knock, and he quietly opened the door and looked in. Overcome by his misfortunes, the millionaire had sunk into a profound sleep and was snoring softly. The Duke stepped inside the room, left the door open a couple of inches, drew a chair to it, and sat down, watching the staircase through the opening of the door. He sat frowning, with a look of profound pity on his face. Once the suspense grew too much for him, he rose and walked up and down the room. His well-bred calm seemed to have deserted him. He muttered curses on Gershard, Monsieur Formerie, and the whole French criminal system very softly under his breath. His face was distorted to a mask of fury, and once he wiped the little beads of sweat from his forehead with his handkerchief. Then he recovered himself, sat down in the chair, and resumed his watch on the stairs. At last, at the end of half an hour, which had seemed to him months long, he heard voices. The drawing-room door shut, and there were footsteps on the stairs. The inspector and Sonia came into view. He waited till they were at the top of the stairs. Then he came out of the room with his most careless air and said, "Well, Mademoiselle Sonia, I hope you did not find it so very dreadful, after all." She was very pale, and there were undried tears on her cheeks. "It was horrible," she said faintly. "Horrible. Monsieur Formery was all right. He believed me, but that horrible detective would not believe a word I said. He confused me. I hardly knew what I was saying." The Duke ground his teeth softly. "Never mind. It's over now. You had better lie down and rest. I will tell one of the servants to bring you up a glass of wine." He walked with her to the door of her room and said, "Try to sleep. Sleep away the unpleasant memory." She went into her room, and the Duke went downstairs and told the butler to take a glass of champagne up to her. Then he went upstairs to the drawing-room. Monsieur Formery was at the table writing. Gershard stood beside him. He handed what he had written to Gershard, and with a smile of satisfaction, Gershard folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Well, Monsieur Formery, did Mademoiselle Krichnoff throw any fresh light on this mystery?" said the Duke in a tone of faint contempt. "No. In fact, she convinced me that she knew nothing whatever about it. Monsieur Gershard seems to entertain a different opinion. But I think that even he is convinced that Mademoiselle Krichnoff is not a friend of Arsène Lupin." "Oh, well, perhaps she isn't. But there's no telling," said Gershard slowly. "Arsène Lupin?" cried the Duke. "Surely you never thought that Mademoiselle Krichnoff had anything to do with Arsène Lupin?" "I never thought so," said Monsieur Formery. "But when one has a fixed idea, well, one has a fixed idea." He shrugged his shoulders and looked at Gershard with contemptuous eyes. The Duke laughed, an unaffected, ringing laugh, but not a pleasant one. "It's absurd," he cried. "There are always those thefts," said Gershard with a nettled air. "You have nothing to go upon," said Monsieur Formery. "What if she did enter the service of Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin just before the thefts began? Besides, after this lapse of time, if she had committed the thefts, you'd find it a job to bring them home to her. It's not a job worth your doing anyhow. It's a job for an ordinary detective, Gershard." "There's always the pendant," said Gershard. "I am convinced that that pendant is in the house." "Oh, that stupid pendant. I wish I'd never given it to Mademoiselle Gournay-Martin," said the Duke lightly. "I have a feeling that if I could lay my hand on that pendant, if I could find who has it, I should have the key to this mystery." "The devil you would," said the Duke softly. "That is odd. It is the oddest thing about this business I've heard yet." "I have that feeling. I have that feeling," said Gershard quietly. The Duke smiled. Chapter 16. Victoire's Slip. They were silent. The Duke walked to the fireplace, stepped into it, and studied the opening. He came out again and said, "Oh, by the way, Monsieur Formery, the policeman at the front door wanted to stop me going out of the house when I went home to change. I take it that Monsieur Gershard's prohibition does not apply to me." "Of course not. Of course not, Your Grace," said Monsieur Formery quickly. "I saw that you had changed your clothes, Your Grace," said Gershard. "I thought that you had done it here." "No," said the Duke. "I went home." The policeman protested, but he went no further, so I did not throw him into the middle of the street. "Whatever our station, we should respect the law," said Monsieur Formery solemnly. "The Republican law, Monsieur Formery?" "I am a royalist," said the Duke, smiling at him. Monsieur Formery shook his head sadly. "I was wondering," said the Duke, "about Monsieur Gershard's theory that the burglars were let in the front door of this house by an accomplice. Why, when they had this beautiful large opening, did they want a front door too?" "I did not know That was Gertchard's theory, said Monsieur Formery, a trifle contemptuously. Of course they had no need to use the front door. Perhaps they had no need to use the front door, said Gertchard. But after all, the front door was unbolted, and they did not draw the bolts to put us off the scent. Their false scent was already prepared. He waved his hand towards the window. Moreover, you must bear in mind that opening might not have been made when they entered the house. Suppose that, while they were on the other side of the wall, a brick had fallen onto the hearth and alarmed the concierge. We don't know how skillful they are. They might not have cared to risk it. I'm inclined to think on the whole that they did come in through the front door. Monsieur Formery sniffed contemptuously. Perhaps you're right, said the Duke. But the accomplice? I think we shall know more about the accomplice when Victoire awakes, said Gertchard. The family have such confidence in Victoire, said the Duke. Perhaps Lupin has too, said Gertchard grimly. Always Lupin, said Monsieur Formery contemptuously. There came a knock at the door, and a footman appeared on the threshold. He informed the Duke that Germaine had returned from her shopping expedition and was awaiting him in her boudoir. He went to her and tried to persuade her to put in a word for Sonia and endeavor to soften Gertchard's rigor. She refused to do anything of the kind, declaring that, in view of the value of the stolen property, no stone must be left unturned to recover it. The police knew what they were doing. They must have a free hand. The Duke did not press her with any great vigor. He realized the futility of an appeal to a nature so shallow, so self-centered, and so lacking in sympathy. He took his revenge by teasing her about the wedding presents which were still flowing in. Her father's business friends were still striving to outdo one another in the costliness of the jewelry they were giving her. The great houses of the Faubourg Saint-Germain were still refraining firmly from anything that savored of extravagance or ostentation. While he was with her, the 11th paper knife came from his mother's friend, the Duchess of Vaux-l'Église. The Duke was overwhelmed with joy at the sight of it, and his delighted comments drove Germaine to the last extremity of exasperation. The result was that she begged him, with petulant asperity, to get out of her sight. He complied with her request, almost with alacrity, and returned to Monsieur Formery and Gertchard. He found them at a standstill, waiting for reports from the detectives who were hunting outside the house for information about the movements of the burglars with the stolen booty and apparently finding none. The police were also hunting for the stolen motor cars, not only in Paris and its environs, but also all along the road between Paris and Charmerace. At about 5 o'clock, Gertchard grew tired of the inaction and went out himself to assist his subordinates, leaving Monsieur Formery in charge of the house itself. He promised to be back by 7:30 to let the examining magistrate, who had an engagement for the evening, get away. The Duke spent his time between the drawing-room, where Monsieur Formery entertained him with anecdotes of his professional skill, and the boudoir, where Germaine was entertaining envious young friends who came to see her wedding presents. The friends of Germaine were always a little ill at ease in the society of the Duke, belonging, as they did, to that wealthy middle class which has made France what she is. His indifference to the doings of the old friends of his family saddened them, and they were unable to understand his airy and persistent trifling. It seemed to them a discord in the cosmic tune. The afternoon wore away, and at 7:30, Gertchard had not returned. Monsieur Formery waited for him, fuming, for 10 minutes, then left the house in charge of the inspector and went off to his engagement. Monsieur Gournay-Martin was entertaining 2 financiers and their wives, 2 of their daughters, and 2 friends of the Duke, the Baron de Vernon and the Comte de Vauvenus, at dinner that night. Thanks to the Duke, The party was of a liveliness to which the gorgeous dining room had been very little used, since it had been so fortunate as to become the property of Monsieur Gournay-Martin. The millionaire had been looking forward to an evening of luxurious woe, deploring the loss of his treasures, giving their prices to his sympathetic friends. The Duke had other views, and they prevailed. After dinner, the guests went to the smoking room, since the drawing rooms were in possession of Guerchard. Soon after 10, the Duke slipped away from them and went to the detective. Guerchard's was not a face at any time full of expression, and all that the Duke saw on it was a subdued dullness. "Well, Monsieur Guerchard," he said cheerfully, "what luck? Have any of your men come across any traces of the passage of the burglars with their booty?" "No, Your Grace. So far, all the luck has been with the burglars. For all that anyone seems to have seen them, they might have vanished into the bowels of the earth through the floor of the cellars in the empty house next door. That means that they were very quick loading whatever vehicle they used with their plunder. I should think myself that they first carried everything from this house down into the hall of the house next door, and then, of course, they could be very quick getting them from hall to their van, or whatever it was. But still, someone saw that van, saw it drive up to the house, or waiting at the house, or driving away from it." "Is Monsieur Formery coming back?" said the Duke. "Not tonight," said Guerchard. "The affair is in my hands now, and I have my own men on it, men of some intelligence, or at any rate men who know my ways and how I want things done." "It must be a relief," said the Duke. "Oh no, I'm used to Monsieur Formery, to all the examining magistrates in Paris, and in most of the big provincial towns. They do not really hamper me, and often I get an idea from them, for some of them are men of real intelligence." "And others are not, I understand," said the Duke. The door opened, and Bonavent, the detective, came in. "The housekeeper's awake, Monsieur Guerchard," he said. "Good. Bring her down here," said Guerchard. "Perhaps you'd like me to go," said the Duke. "Oh no," said Guerchard. "If it would interest you to hear me question her, please stay." Bonavent left the room. The Duke sat down in an easy chair, and Guerchard stood before the fireplace. "Monsieur Formery told me, when you were out this afternoon, that he believed this housekeeper to be quite innocent," said the Duke idly. "There is certainly one innocent in this affair," said Guerchard, grinning. "Who is that?" said the Duke. "The examining magistrate," said Guerchard. The door opened, and Bonavent brought Victoire in. She was a big, middle-aged woman, with a pleasant, cheerful, ruddy face, black-haired, with sparkling brown eyes, which did not seem to have been at all dimmed by her long, drugged sleep. She looked like a well-to-do farmer's wife, a buxom, good-natured, managing woman. As soon as she came into the room, she said quickly, "I wish, Mr. Inspector, your man would have given me time to put on a decent dress. I must have been sleeping in this one ever since those rascals tied me up and put that smelly handkerchief over my face. I never saw such a nasty-looking crew as they were in my life." "How many were there, Madame Victoire?" said Guerchard. "Dozens. The house was just swarming with them. I heard the noise. I came downstairs, and on the landing outside the door here, one of them jumped on me from behind and nearly choked me, to prevent me from screaming, I suppose." "And they were a nasty-looking crew, were they?" said Guerchard. "Did you see their faces?" "No. I wish I had. I should know them again if I had. But they were all masked," said Victoire. "Sit down, Madame Victoire. There's no need to tire you," said Guerchard. And she sat down on a chair facing him. "Let's see. You sleep in one of the top rooms, Madame Victoire. It has a dormer window, set in the roof, hasn't it? Said Gershard, in the same polite, pleasant voice. Yes, yes, but what has that got to do with it? Said Victoire. Please answer my questions, said Gershard sharply. You went to sleep in your room. Did you hear any noise on the roof? On the roof? How should I hear it on the roof? There wouldn't be any noise on the roof, said Victoire. You heard nothing on the roof? Said Gershard. No, the noise I heard was down here, said Victoire. Yes, and you came down to see what was making it. And you were seized from behind on the landing and brought in here, said Gershard. Yes, that's right, said Madame Victoire. And were you tied up and gagged on the landing, or in here, said Gershard. Oh, I was caught on the landing and pushed in here and then tied up, said Victoire. I'm sure that wasn't one man's job, said Gershard, looking at her vigorous figure with admiring eyes. You may be sure of that, said Victoire. It took 4 of them, and at least 2 of them have some nice bruises on their shins to show for it. I'm sure they have. And it serves them jolly well right, said Gershard, in a tone of warm approval. And I suppose, while those 4 were tying you up, the others stood round and looked on. Oh no, they were far too busy for that, said Victoire. What were they doing? Said Gershard. They were taking the pictures off the walls and carrying them out of the window down the ladder, said Victoire. Gershard's eyes flickered towards the Duke, but the expression of earnest inquiry on his face never changed. Now tell me, did the man who took a picture from the walls carry it down the ladder himself, or did he hand it through the window to a man who was standing on the top of a ladder ready to receive it? He said. Victoire paused as if to recall their action. Then she said, Oh, he got through the window and carried it down the ladder himself. You're sure of that? Said Gershard. Oh yes, I am quite sure of it. Why should I deceive you, Mr. Inspector? Said Victoire quickly, and the Duke saw the first shadow of uneasiness on her face. Of course not, said Gershard. And where were you? Oh, they put me behind the screen. No, where were you when you came into the room? I was against the door, said Victoire. And where was the screen? Said Gershard. Was it before the fireplace? No, it was on one side, the left-hand side, said Victoire. Oh, will you show me exactly where it stood? Said Gershard. Victoire rose, and Gershard, aiding her, set the screen on the left-hand side of the fireplace. Gershard stepped back and looked at it. Now this is very important, he said. I must have the exact position of the 4 feet of that screen. Let's see. Some chalk, of course. You do some dressmaking, don't you, Madame Victoire? Oh, yes. I sometimes make a dress for one of the maids in my spare time, said Victoire. Then you've got a piece of chalk on you, said Gershard. Oh, yes, said Victoire, putting her hand to the pocket of her dress. She paused, took a step backwards, and looked wildly round the room, while the colour slowly faded in her ruddy cheeks. What am I talking about? She said, in an uncertain, shaky voice. I haven't any chalk. I ran out of chalk the day before yesterday. I think you have, Madame Victoire. Feel in your pocket and see, said Gershard sternly. His voice had lost its suavity, his face its smile, his eyes had grown dangerous. No, I have no chalk, cried Victoire. With a sudden leap, Gershard sprang upon her, caught her in a firm grip with his right arm, and his left hand plunged into her pocket. Let me go, you're hurting, she cried. Gershard loosed her and stepped back. What's this? He said, and he held up, between his thumb and forefinger, a piece of blue chalk. Victoire drew herself up and faced him gallantly. Well, what of it? It is chalk. Mayn't an honest woman carry chalk in her pockets without being insulted and pulled about by every policeman she comes across? She cried. That will be for the examining magistrate to decide, said Gershard, and he went to the door and called Bonavent. Bonavent came in, and Gershard said, "When the prison van comes, put this woman in it, and send her down to the station." "But what have I done?" cried Victoire. "I'm innocent. I declare I'm innocent. I've done nothing at all. It's not a crime to carry a piece of chalk in one's pocket." "Now, that's a matter for the examining magistrate. You can explain it to him," said Gershard. "I've got nothing to do with it, so it's no good making a fuss now. Do go quietly. There's a good woman." He spoke in a quiet, businesslike tone. Victoire looked him in the eyes, then drew herself up and went quietly out of the room. Chapter 17. Sonia's Escape. "One of Monsieur Formery's innocents," said Gershard, turning to the Duke. "The chalk," said the Duke. "Is it the same chalk?" "It's blue," said Gershard, holding it out, "the same as that of the signatures on the walls." Add that fact to the woman's sudden realization of what she was doing, and you'll see that they were written with it. "It is rather a surprise," said the Duke. "To look at her, you would think that she was the most honest woman in the world." "Ah, you don't know Lupin, your Grace," said Gershard. "He can do anything with women, and they'll do anything for him. And what's more, as far as I can see, it doesn't make a scrap of difference whether they're honest or not. The fair-haired lady I was telling you about was probably an honest woman. Ganimard is sure of it. We should have found out long ago who she was if she had been a wrong-un. And Ganimard also swears that when he arrested Lupin on board the Provence, some woman, some ordinary, honest woman among the passengers, carried away Lady Garland's jewels, which he had stolen, and was bringing to America, and along with them a matter of £800, which he had stolen from a fellow passenger on the voyage. That power of fascination which some men exercise on women is one of those mysteries which science should investigate before it does anything else," said the Duke in a reflective tone. "Now, I come to think of it, I had much better have spent my time on that investigation than on that tedious journey to the South Pole. All the same, I'm deucedly sorry for that woman Victoire. She looks such a good soul." Gershard shrugged his shoulders. "The prisons are full of good souls," he said, with cynical wisdom born of experience. "They get caught so much more often than the bad." "It seems rather mean of Lupin to make use of women like this and get them into trouble," said the Duke. "But he doesn't," said Gershard quickly. "At least, he hasn't up to now. This Victoire is the first we've caught. I look on it as a good omen." He walked across the room, picked up his cloak, and took a card case from the inner pocket of it. "If you don't mind, Your Grace, I want you to show this permit to my men who are keeping the door whenever you go out of the house. It's just a formality, but I attach considerable importance to it, for I really ought not to make exceptions in favor of anyone. I have 2 men at the door, and they have orders to let nobody out without my written permission. Of course, Monsieur Gournay-Martin's guests are different. Bonavent has orders to pass them out, and if Your Grace doesn't mind, it will help me. If you carry a permit, no one else will dream of complaining of having to do so." "Oh, I don't mind if it's of any help to you," said the Duke cheerfully. "Thank you," said Gershard, and he wrote on his card and handed it to the Duke. The Duke took it and looked at it. On it was written, "Pass the Duke of Charmerace. J. Gershard." "It's quite military," said the Duke, putting the card into his waistcoat pocket. There came a knock at the door, and a tall, thin, bearded man came into the room. "Ah, Dieuzy, at last! What news?" cried Gershard. Dieuzy saluted. "I've learnt that a motor van was waiting outside the next house, in the side street, he said. At what time? Said Gershard. Between 4 and 5 in the morning, said Ducey. Who saw it? Said Gershard. A scavenger. He thinks that it was nearly 5 o'clock when the van drove off. Between 4 and 5, nearly 5. Then they filled up the opening before they loaded the van. I thought they would, said Gershard thoughtfully. Anything else? A few minutes after the van had gone, a man in motoring dress came out of the house, said Ducey. In motoring dress? Said Gershard quickly. Yes, and a little way from the house he threw away his cigarette. The scavenger thought the whole business a little queer, and he picked up the cigarette and kept it. Here it is. He handed it to Gershard, whose eyes scanned it carelessly and then glued themselves to it. A gold-tipped cigarette marked Mercedes. Why, Your Grace, this is one of your cigarettes. But this is incredible, cried the Duke. Not at all, said Gershard. It's merely another link in the chain. I've no doubt you have some of these cigarettes at Charmerace. Oh, yes, I've had a box on most of the tables, said the Duke. Well, there you are, said Gershard. Oh, I see what you're driving at, said the Duke. You mean that one of the Charolais must have taken a box. Well, we know that they'd hardly stick at a box of cigarettes, said Gershard. Yes, but I thought, said the Duke, and he paused. You thought what? Said Gershard. Then Lupin, since it was Lupin who managed the business last night, since you found those salvias in the house next door, then Lupin came from Charmerace. Evidently, said Gershard, and Lupin is one of the Charolais. Oh, that's another matter, said Gershard. But it's certain, absolutely certain, said the Duke. We have the connecting links. The salvias. This cigarette. It looks very like it. You're pretty quick on a scent, I must say, said Gershard. What a detective you would have made, only nothing is certain. But it is. Whatever more do you want? Was he at Charmerace yesterday, or was he not? Did he, or did he not, arrange the theft of the motor cars? Certainly he did, but he himself might have remained in the background all the while, said Gershard. In what shape? Under what mask? By Jove, I should like to see this fellow, said the Duke. We shall see him tonight, said Gershard. Tonight? Said the Duke. Of course we shall, for he will come to steal the coronet between 11:45 and midnight, said Gershard. Never, said the Duke. You don't really believe that he'll have the cheek to attempt such a mad act? Ah, you don't know this man, Your Grace, his extraordinary mixture of coolness and audacity. It's the danger that attracts him. He throws himself into the fire, and he doesn't get burnt. For the last 10 years I've been saying to myself, here we are. This time I've got him. At last I'm going to nab him. But I've said that day after day, said Gershard, and he paused. Well, said the Duke. Well, the days pass, and I never nab him. Oh, he is thick, I tell you. He's a joker. He is a regular artist. He ground his teeth. The damned thief. The Duke looked at him and said slowly, Then you think that tonight Lupin— You've followed the scent with me, Your Grace, Gershard interrupted quickly and vehemently. We've picked up each clue together. You've almost seen this man at work. You've understood him. Isn't a man like this, I ask you, capable of anything? He is, said the Duke with conviction. Well then, said Gershard. Perhaps you're right, said the Duke. Gershard turned to Ducey and said, in a quieter voice, And when the scavenger had picked up the cigarette, did he follow the motorist? Yes, he followed him for about 100 yards. He went down into Sureau Street and turned westwards. Then a motor car came along. He got into it and went off. "What kind of a motor car?" said Gershard. "A big car and dark red in color," said Ducey. "The limousine!" cried the Duke. "That's all I've got so far, sir," said Ducey. "Well, off you go," said Gershard. "Now that you've got started, you'll probably get something else before very long." Ducey saluted and went. "Things are beginning to move," said Gershard cheerfully. "First Victoire, and now this motor van." "They are indeed," said the Duke. "After all, it ought not to be very difficult to trace that motor van," said Gershard in a musing tone. "At any rate, its movements ought to be easy enough to follow up till about 6. Then, of course, there would be a good many others about delivering goods." "You seem to have all the possible information you can want at your finger ends," said the Duke in an admiring tone. "I suppose I know the life of Paris as well as anybody," said Gershard. They were silent for a while. Then Germain's maid, Irma, came into the room and said, "If you please, Your Grace, Mademoiselle Krichnoff would like to speak to you for a moment." "Oh, where is she?" said the Duke. "She's in her room, Your Grace." "Oh, very well. I'll go up to her," said the Duke. "I can speak to her in the library." He rose and was going towards the door when Gershard stepped forward, barring his way, and said, "No, Your Grace." "No? Why?" said the Duke haughtily. "I beg you will wait a minute or two till I've had a word with you," said Gershard, and he drew a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and held it up. The Duke looked at Gershard's face, and he looked at the paper in his hand. Then he said, "Oh, very well." And turning to Irma, he added quietly, "Tell Mademoiselle Krichnoff that I'm in the drawing-room." "Yes, Your Grace, in the drawing-room," said Irma, and she turned to go. "Yes, and say that I shall be engaged for the next 5 minutes. The next 5 minutes, do you understand?" said the Duke. "Yes, Your Grace," said Irma, and she went out of the door. "Ask Mademoiselle Krichnoff to put on her hat and cloak," said Gershard. "Yes, sir," said Irma, and she went. The Duke turned sharply on Gershard and said, "Now, why on earth? I don't understand." "I got this from Monsieur Formery," said Gershard, holding up the paper. "Well," said the Duke, "what is it?" "It's a warrant, Your Grace," said Gershard. "What?" "A warrant. Not for the arrest of Mademoiselle Krichnoff." "Yes," said Gershard. "Oh, come. It's impossible," said the Duke. "You're never going to arrest that child." "I am indeed," said Gershard. "Her examination this afternoon was in the highest degree unsatisfactory. Her answers were embarrassed, contradictory, and in every way suspicious." "And you've made up your mind to arrest her?" said the Duke slowly, knitting his brow in anxious thought. "I have indeed," said Gershard, "and I'm going to do it now. The prison van ought to be waiting at the door." He looked at his watch. "She and Victoire can go together." "So, you're going to arrest her? You're going to arrest her?" said the Duke thoughtfully, and he took a step or two up and down the room, still thinking hard. "Well, you understand the position, don't you, Your Grace?" said Gershard, in a tone of apology. "Believe me that personally I've no animosity against Mademoiselle Krichnoff. In fact, the child attracts me." "Yes," said the Duke softly, in a musing tone. "She has the air of a child who has lost its way in life. And that poor little hiding place she found, that rolled-up handkerchief, thrown down in the corner of the little room in the house next door. It was absolutely absurd." "What? A handkerchief?" cried Gershard, with an air of sudden, utter surprise. "The child's clumsiness is positively pitiful," said the Duke. "What was in the handkerchief? The pearls of the pendant?" cried Gershard. "Yes. I supposed you knew all about it. Of course, Monsieur Formery left word for you," said the Duke, with an air of surprise at the ignorance of the detective. "No, I've heard nothing about it," cried Gershard. "He didn't leave word for you," said the Duke, in a tone of greater surprise. "Oh, well, I dare say that he thought tomorrow would do. Of course you were out of the house when he found it. She must have slipped out of her room soon after you went. He found a handkerchief belonging to Mademoiselle Krichnoff." "Where is it?" cried Gershard. "Monsieur Formery took the pearls, but he left the handkerchief." "I suppose it's in the corner where he found it," said the Duke. "He left the handkerchief," cried Gershard. "If that isn't just like the fool! He ought to keep hens. It's all he's fit for." He ran to the fireplace, seized the lantern, and began lighting it. "Where is the handkerchief?" he cried. "In the left-hand corner of the little room on the right on the second floor. But if you're going to arrest Mademoiselle Krichnoff, why are you bothering about the handkerchief?" "It can't be of any importance," said the Duke. "I beg your pardon," said Gershard. "But it is." "But why?" said the Duke. "I was arresting Mademoiselle Krichnoff all right because I had a very strong presumption of her guilt, but I hadn't the slightest proof of it," said Gershard. "What?" cried the Duke in a horrified tone. "No, you've just given me the proof. And since she was able to hide the pearls in the house next door, she knew the road which led to it. Therefore, she's an accomplice," said Gershard in a triumphant tone. "What? Do you think that too?" cried the Duke. "Good heavens, and it's me. It's my senselessness. It's my fault that you've got your proof." He spoke in a tone of acute distress. "It was your duty to give it me," said Gershard sternly, and he began to mount the steps. "Shall I come with you?" "I know where the handkerchief is," said the Duke quickly. "No, thank you, Your Grace," said Gershard. "I prefer to go alone." "You'd better let me help you," said the Duke. "No, Your Grace," said Gershard firmly. "I must really insist," said the Duke. "No, no, no," said Gershard vehemently, with stern decision. "It's no use your insisting, Your Grace. I prefer to go alone. I shall only be gone a minute or two." "Just as you like," said the Duke stiffly. The legs of Gershard disappeared up the steps. The Duke stood listening with all his ears. Directly he heard the sound of Gershard's heels on the floor. When he dropped from the chimney-piece of the next room, he went swiftly to the door, opened it, and went out. Bonavent was sitting on the chair on which the young policeman had sat during the afternoon. Sonia, in her hat and cloak, was halfway down the stairs. The Duke put his head inside the drawing-room door and said to the empty room, "Here is Mademoiselle Krichnoff, Monsieur Gershard." He held open the door. Sonia came down the stairs and went through it. The Duke followed her into the drawing-room and shut the door. "There's not a moment to lose," he said in a low voice. "Oh, what is it, Your Grace?" said Sonia anxiously. "Gershard has a warrant for your arrest." "Then I'm lost," cried Sonia in a panic-stricken voice. "No, you're not. You must go at once," said the Duke. "But how can I go? No one can get out of the house. Monsieur Gershard won't let them," cried Sonia, panic-stricken. "We can get over that," said the Duke. He ran to Gershard's cloak, took the card case from the inner pocket, went to the writing table, and sat down. He took from his waistcoat pocket the permit which Gershard had given him and a pencil. Then he took a card from the card case, set the permit on the table before him, and began to imitate Gershard's handwriting with an amazing exactness. He wrote on the card, "Pass Mademoiselle Krichnoff." J. Gershard. Sonia stood by his side, panting quickly with fear, and watched him do it. He had scarcely finished the last stroke when they heard a noise on the other side of the opening into the empty house. The Duke looked at the fireplace, and his teeth bared in an expression of cold ferocity. He rose with clenched fists and took a step towards the fireplace. "Your Grace?" Your Grace, called the voice of Gershard. What is it? Answered the Duke quietly. I can't see any handkerchief, said Gershard. Didn't you say it was in the left-hand corner of the little room on the right? I told you you'd better let me come with you and find it, said the Duke, in a tone of triumph. It's in the right-hand corner of the little room on the left. I could have sworn you said the little room on the right, said Gershard. They heard his footfalls die away. Now, you must get out of the house quickly, said the Duke. Show this card to the detectives at the door, and they'll pass you without a word. He pressed the card into her hand. But, this card, stammered Sonia. There's no time to lose, said the Duke. But this is madness, said Sonia. When Gershard finds out about this card, that you... There's no need to bother about that, interrupted the Duke quickly. Where are you going to? A little hotel near the Star. I've forgotten the name of it, said Sonia. But this card... Has it a telephone? Said the Duke. Yes. No. 555 Central, said Sonia. If I haven't telephoned to you before 8:30 tomorrow morning, come straight to my house, said the Duke, scribbling the telephone number on his shirt cuff. Yes, said Sonia. But this card... When Gershard knows, when he discovers... Oh, I can't let you get into trouble for me. I shan't. But go, said the Duke, and he slipped his right arm round her and drew her to the door. Oh, how good you are to me, said Sonia softly. The Duke's other arm went round her. He drew her to him, and their lips met. He loosed her and opened the door, saying loudly, You're sure you won't have a cab, Mademoiselle Krichnoff? No, thank you, Your Grace. Good night, said Sonia, and she went through the door with a transfigured face